Gold Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host, the Yao Mean of Revolution. We got a World War III alert. NATO has made a big mistake. Attempt on Putin's home. Russia vows to punish him. Before we get into that, be sure to wipe your feet. That means hit the like button. You in the House of Revolution. Like, share, subscribe, support the platform. Y'all, very dangerous times we are living in. Zelensky meets Trump while they also try to assassinate Putin. Let's get into the content. Salute.
This is WW3. We've got word of major escalation here between Russia and Ukraine at a time when many were thinking peace was going to happen. Russia's foreign ministry saying that Ukraine has tried to assassinate Vladimir Putin, trying to attack his residence in the Novgorod region, sending some 91 long-range drones, all which were destroyed by Russia's air defenses. They say that this is reckless action. It will not go unanswered, and that in terms of the talks that they're on hold, their negotiating position will have to be reviewed. So Ukraine, in return, Zelensky and all them are saying that that's a lie, and they're trying to say that Moscow is preparing for a massive assault on Kiev to hit government buildings inside Kiev. Now, there has to be some kind of proof, evidence, satellite imagery, something to show that these drones went into Russia and then made these strikes or attempted to make these strikes. There has to be some kind of something out there, or else it's going to stand as a possible staged event. You know, without any proof, they're definitely going to try to say this or that or wing out there some wild accusations. But it looks like Russia is putting the pressure on, basically saying that, look, you come to the table to talk for peace for real, or we're going to start pounding out Kiev. And if that's the case, anything can happen at any moment. I think everyone is absolutely sick and tired of the back and forth and tired of Zelensky holding this whole thing up. So Zelensky better really watch his tail in Kiev at this point, because he would be the prime target in all this, knowing that once he's removed, elections could take place. Whatever leadership is going to come after that can get put in place. And all this talk of the United States and Russia having big economic ties and big negotiations on the table, all that can go into motion instead of war, which has just been costing lives left and right. But to be this brazen, to try to strike the home of Vladimir Putin, is about as far as they can go at this point. They're not going to come close to hitting the Kremlin or anything like that because of the defenses around it. I think that they thought there would be less defenses around this position, and that's why they tried to strike it. But prepare for blowback, big time, they say here, because huge moves are about to be made from Russia in retaliation to this. I'll leave
Ukraine has crossed a red line. Moscow says Kiev launched a terrorist drone strike on President Vladimir Putin's state residence in Russia's Novgorod region, dragging the war straight into the heart of Russian leadership security.
On the night of December 28, 2025, the Kiev regime carried out a terrorist attack using a 91mm long-range unmanned aerial vehicle at the presidential residence of the Russian Federation in the Novgorod region. All unmanned aerial vehicles have been destroyed by the Russian Air Defense Forces. No data on the damage caused by the BPLA debris has been received. Please note that this action was carried out during intensive negotiations between Russia and the United States on the settlement of the Ukrainian conflict. Such reckless actions will not be left unanswered. Objects for retaliatory strikes and their time in the hands of the Russian armed forces are determined. At the same time, we do not intend to leave the negotiating process with the United States. At the same time, given the final rebirth of the criminal Kiev regime, which has moved to the policy of state terrorism, the negotiating position of Russia will be reconsidered.
Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov confirms the scale of the provocation. 91 long-range drones hurled at a protected presidential site. A reckless escalation encouraged by Western handlers hiding behind NATO desks. Russia's air defense shield did not blink. Every single drone was destroyed, exposing once again the hollowness of NATO-backed Ukrainian firepower and the failure of Western escalation games. Moscow calls it what it is: state-sponsored terrorism backed by Ukraine, as Russia signals that such attacks on its leadership and sovereignty will not be brushed aside.
They're tired. Are they ready for a deal?
People want peace. 87% support peace. At the same time, 85% against to withdraw from East, from the Donbass. It's meant that everybody wants peace, but just peace.
That was Volodymyr Zelensky last night on Fox News, where he was being interviewed by Brett Baier following his meeting with Trump earlier in the day, following Trump's conversation with Vladimir Putin, as everybody's trying to find an end to this. Trump also spoke with European leaders. We're going to talk a lot about that today as well. But this really, the reason we started with that soundbite right there, because that's one of the central and biggest areas of dispute right now that hasn't even come close to being accepted or resolved. And that is the territorial issue. As I've been telling you throughout this whole process, and meaning throughout this whole war, the Russian side has been almost nonstop adamant on several key issues with which they have not changed at all. Not when this war started, not when the negotiations in 2022, not when they were losing on the battlefield in a couple of key battles in 2023, and certainly not in 2024 on forward. And that is, they say they have to have a demilitarization of the Ukrainian armed forces, denazification of the government, the territorial acquisition of all four of the territories that they annexed in 2022, no NATO and neutrality status for Ukraine, and of course, also change constitution for the Russian-speaking people that would be inside of whatever's left of Ukraine. That's what they have said before. That's what they have said during. That's what they're saying today. And central in that is that issue of the four oblasts, which of course includes the Donbass. And there's still a significant portion of that, which right now still belongs in Ukraine hands, that has not been won by the Russian side. And you hear this has been over and over. People have been asking Trump about this. Will you accept or will you require Donbass to be given back to Russia? Will you require it of the Ukraine side? And to try to put that to rest, you saw Zelensky there. That was one of the key questions that Brett Baer asked him right off the top. The people of Ukraine are tired of war. Are you willing to make that concession if that's what it costs to get it? And he says, well, yeah, you're right. This is what Zelensky's saying. The Ukrainian people do want the war to end. They are significantly desiring peace. But he says 87% say not if it comes at the expense of giving his territory. Now, this should be self-evident. Russia has the militarily dominant position. They are going to win this war. The end is already known. The only question remains, how bad will the loss be? That should be clear by now. Therefore, you cannot want to have a negotiated settlement that gives up the Donbass or some of these other things that are required. But the question is, can you compel compliance? And that is where the West, and especially Europe, seems to think the answer is yes. We know Zelensky does. He just said it right there. He's been saying it nonstop. Trump is more ambivalent. In fact, as some of the sound bites you're going to see from yesterday's meeting, he kind of waffled on some of this and wouldn't take a hard position. But he definitely didn't say yes. Europeans, on the other hand, seem to be more adamant on the Ukrainian side can keep the Donbass. They're saying, no, we want a just and lasting peace. You hear Keir Starmer say that on a regular basis. Emmanuel Macron has now adopted that language. Lots of people do. Just and lasting peace, which they define as an outcome that Kiev likes. And of course, Kiev likes to have its territory. So it doesn't like the fact that where the current line of contact is, everything on the east side of that they've lost. But apparently they're coming close to being willing to accept that. But they will not accept giving up any territory they haven't lost. Now, you can understand that desire. That makes perfect sense. I totally get that. I would definitely have that same desire were I in their shoes. No question about that. Unambiguous. However, were I also in their shoes, because I would not want to lose more than that territory, at some point you're going to have to come up with a hard decision to do what is forced upon you. I won't even call it the right thing or the wrong thing or anything else. I'm going to say what is required. Because if you don't voluntarily surrender this territory through negotiations and withdraw from it, then it will be taken from you. Now, you can say you don't want to do that. And the Europeans are with this point that they think that they can hold out. They think that the Ukraine side can hold out. And so presumably behind the scenes, they're saying to Ukraine, don't give in on this issue. They're apparently trying to convince Trump not to go in on this issue, not to agree to it. All they're doing is setting the stage for more Ukrainian deaths. I'm just going to categorically say this. It should be self-evident at this point. You are condemning more Ukrainian people to death, and you will lose not just those 4 oblasts that are on the table in negotiations right now. You'll lose much more of that. That is the likelihood. Nothing is ever guaranteed in war, but that is the likelihood. And you have many in Europe that are seeming to not being able to understand this. I'm going to show you just a couple of X posts that have come out here just the last little bit, last hour, I think. At least this one here. This one's, I think, like 36 minutes ago, something like that. Zelensky is saying, I have just spoken with Bundeskanzler Friedrich Merz. First and foremost, we discussed the outcomes of the meeting with President Trump and his team in Florida. I informed him about the main emphasis and the key issues raised. Thank you, Friedrich, for your advice and constant coordination. Of course, we discussed today's Russia's fake. There's some fake news. Russia apparently is claiming that something that belonging to Vladimir Putin was attacked by Ukraine, which undermines peace or something. I don't know. I haven't seen this, so I don't know if it's true or not. That's what he's claiming, that it's fake, and the Russians just trying to drag the war out. Much more important, Putin needs to come to terms. Putin needs to come to terms with the fact that he must end the war on terms happy with Zelensky. The strikes and the bloodshed, all that must end. Ukraine is doing everything to achieve peace. Russia must stop inventing ways to wage war and start thinking about how to restore security. So you see there that Zelensky is continuing to lecture the Russian side. And it's not minor that this comes after the meeting with Trump. So if Trump is trying to pull all these disparate sides together to come up with some kind of a scenario that will end the war, it's not succeeding. You see the Ukraine side remains way over here to where they are. You saw the statement by Brett Baer in front of Brett Baer just a second ago on Fox News. We're not going to give up the Donbass. We're not going to give up that area. It's just not going to happen. And then you see him still pointing all the fingers at the Russian side. You have to do this. You must do that. We're doing everything, and it's you that's not doing it, meaning I'm not going to change anything. And, of course, as you know, and by the way, this afternoon at 2 o'clock, we have Andrei Mardianov there, one of our famous favorite experts on the Russian military. He's going to give us the interpretation of what the Russians are saying, and we're going to show you several things that they're saying there. So I want to focus on that part later, but I want to keep the focus right here on what the Ukraine's and the European side is doing. And here also is an ex-post came out just a little bit ago from Emmanuel Macron, president of France. He says, along with several other European leaders, I took part this evening, this is from yesterday, in an exchange with President Zelensky and President Trump. I then spoke with President Zelensky. We are making progress on security guarantees that will be central to, there's that phrase again, a just and lasting peace. We will bring together the countries of the coalition of the willing. If just and lasting peace is Keir Starmer's favorite phrase, coalition of the willing seems to be Emmanuel Macron's favorite phrase, in Paris in early January to finalize each country's concrete contributions. So a couple things that are really important to notice about that is that, number one, nobody's moving quick on here. Nobody's thinking that this is going to be a breakthrough. And that also illustrates something I think that's really interesting to point out here and to observe, a substantial break from historic diplomatic norms in the West. And I'm talking centuries of norms. Ordinarily, when you had heads of state that were going to meet together in some kind of a summit or a forum or any kind of a meeting, you had lots and lots of hard work at the NUG level, at the worker level, and especially at the senior diplomatic level, where all these contentious issues were figured out and that they came up with an answer so that when the heads of state got together, then they made final decisions. Got it over that last 2 or 3%, whatever that may be, the little bit of disputes, in order to come up with a deal and then sign documents, whatever. That's what ordinarily happens. So historically, when you see the heads of state, that means that a lot of hard work had been done behind the scenes. Thorny issues had been resolved and they got together. Take example of the Korean War and even the Vietnamese War. There was long negotiations, years in the process, and lots of it the worker level that was done. Only when the deals were done, everybody had agreed to it, did you get the senior officials that came together and signed documents. That's how it normally works. Now then, we have, and you can go back to Anchorage, Alaska, when Trump rolled out the red carpet for Putin, he said, 5 times I thought I had a deal. Well, you couldn't have possibly thought that, because the Russians have never changed their viewpoint, and the hard work at the NUG level hadn't been done. And now here we have another one that Trump got on the phone with Putin, was physically meeting with Zelensky again, as he does many times. And that's fine if you want to get together and meet. But I mean, you can typically do those things on the phone, behind the scenes, etc. But until you've done the hard work at the worker bee level and come up with an understanding that everybody's ready to live with, you're never going to end. So when you have the heads of state meeting and nothing happens, it diminishes diplomacy. It diminishes the value of the head of state. Now people don't even hardly pay attention to it, because basically he has made himself a worker bee level. But the problem is, because none of the hard work has been done, when Trump gets together and he says, I think we're real close here, as he did, and that's one of the sound bites I think I showed earlier, he's not. He's been saying that throughout this whole process. He's been saying that since he got elected and before he took office. And he's been saying it nearly all the way through. I think we're really close. I bet if we put together, we could probably come up with a dozen or more statements from Trump over the last 11 months where he said, I think we're really close. And obviously we weren't. We never have been. And we're not now either. And then you see even Macron there. He's talking about, we're going to get together sometime in January, and then we'll start talking about, meaning this thing's just going to drag on for right now. Don't anybody think that we're close to a peace, because we're not. We're definitely not. And that's just on the security guarantees is what he was talking about there. That's not even on the contentious issue of demilitarization, of the territorial issues, of the denazification, of the issue with the personnel changing the constitution of Ukraine, which of course harkens all the way back to the Minsk Accords, which was never done there. That's still on the table from the Russians. So you haven't even gotten to the harder issues yet. So folks, we're nowhere near any kind of a solution to this. And of course, that leaves us with one inescapable conclusions that what we do see on the ground is going to continue going on. The reality on the battlefield, as we tell you all the time, that's the only real progress that you can count and measure. And Russia has continued to expand its capabilities. They've expanded their territorial acquisitions. They have increased the casualty rates on the Ukraine soldiers, and they have increased their own capacity in manpower, industrial capacity. Their economy is still quite strong despite all the things we're trying to do. And there is no evidence of any kind that any of those things are going to be upended in the foreseeable future. And the Ukraine side cannot survive that long because they are, in the foreseeable future, they're not going to be able to hold on much longer. Well, let's take a look at some of the specifics here. Zelensky, at the post press conference once he left here, he actually thinks, hey, we made some great progress here.
We had a really great discussions on all the topics, and we appreciate the progress that was made by American and Ukrainian teams in these recent weeks, our teams. And we discussed all the aspects of the peace framework, which includes, and we have a great achievements, 20-point peace plan, 90% agreed, and U.S.-Ukraine security guarantees, 100% agreed. U.S.-Europe-Ukraine security guarantees, almost agreed. Military dimension, 100% agreed. Prosperity plan being finalized, and we also discussed the sequencing of the following actions. And we agree that security guarantees is the key milestone in achieving lasting peace, and our teams will continue working on all aspects.
Okay, so that's a pretty big laundry list right there, but that's fantasy, folks. You need to understand that. That's fantasy. He's talking about his 20-point peace plan is 90% of the way there. I did a show on this, I think, over the weekend or here just a few days back, where I told you his 20-point peace plan has at least 4 poison pills in it from the Russian side and 3 omissions that aren't even mentioned in there, which are also non-starters. So you can't be 20% of the, or 90% of the way there when major ill issues with the other side of the negotiations, and it's impossible to reach a negotiated settlement until both sides have come to an agreement. And so you're miles away from the other side. So you're not 90% of the way to anything. Maybe you're 90% of the way to an agreement on the Western side, meaning Europe, Ukraine, and the United States. I don't know. I don't know if even that's accurate. I worry that may be the case. I think probably Ukraine and Europe probably are at 100%. I think that they're probably of one mind on this, and they're trying to drag Trump back into their orbit here. But he's not willing to go that far. And so far, thankfully, he has continued to hesitate. More on that in a second. But let's look at a couple of things he mentioned there. He said, this is what Zelensky just said in that soundbite. He said, U.S. and Ukraine security guarantees are 100% agreed. Remember that number? He said 100% guarantee. He said U.S. and European security guarantees understandings are almost there. I think, I don't remember if that was 95%, but he said we're almost there. And then he says the military dimension is 100% agreed to. So he's speaking for President Trump and the United States when he says 100% on U.S. and Ukraine security guarantees and 100% on the military dimension. They didn't define exactly what that meant, but he said that there's 100% agreement with there. Well, when President Trump was asked that same question on security guarantees, he had a somewhat more nuanced position.
Ukraine security guarantees, what number are we at right now?
Well, I think you can say 95%, but I don't like to say percentages. I just think we're doing very well. We could be very close. There are 1 or 2 very thorny issues, very tough issues, but I think we're doing very well. We made a lot of progress today, but really we've made it over the last month. This is not a one-day process deal. This is very complicated stuff, but I think when the president says 95, I think, could be close to 95%.
This is very complicated stuff, he says, which again underscores this is why you have worker level stuff done behind the scenes before you ever get together, so that you don't have to stand there after your head of state meeting and say, well, there's a lot of difficulties. There's some thorny issues that have to be resolved and some difficulties. Yeah, no kidding. That's why you have it the other way. That's why you don't do it this way, because now then the thorny issues can't be worked out. Trump is not an expert in these things. That's why it is vital that you have absolute subject matter experts on your side, and that every side brings their subject matter experts. And by subject matter expert, I mean you understand America, you understand Europe, you understand Ukraine, you understand the Russian side, and you understand military things, and you understand diplomatic terms, and you have a lot of experience. That's what your team should bring to the table. That's how it's supposed to work, so that when you get these guys together, they understand each of the other side's viewpoints. Every one of these teams are supposed to understand that of the others. So now then you know where the real issues are going to come into. So you take care of, like I told you on that 20-point plan, there was, I don't remember the exact number, maybe 10 or 12 of them even. Were probably some things we can work on. So you say, you get this group together and you go, all right, we can figure these out. Oh, we're relatively good on these. All right, let's table those. Those are done. Okay. 50%, right? Number wise, anyway. Now let's get to the issues which are hard, because they're in some cases you can get 95% in agreement on this, but that last 5% or those last 2 or 3 points are literal deal breakers if they don't get fixed by themselves. So the number of points agreed to is really inconsequential. What matters is the ones that really are fundamental. And that's what these kinds of working groups can solve. Trump can't. He's not an expert in the military. He's not an expert in diplomacy. He knows almost nothing about Ukraine, Russia, or Europe, other than businessman kind of things and deals that he loves to do. That's it. And that is not close to being. Ergo, he can't function as the subject matter expert to make deals, because he may agree to something that would be bad for America that he would never know because he doesn't have the expertise. If he had an expert team together, they would know all of those things, and they wouldn't agree to anything or would not recommend that he agree to anything. And then they would brief him on, here's where the issues are, here's the problems, here's the background, etc. So now he can go in armed with a lot of information. And then if he needs to make hard decisions, that's how it works. We're doing it the worst possible way here. But listen, let's get back to the specific thing on that soundbite there about security guarantees. There should be no security guarantees. None from the United States. And there's not going to be any either. It depending on how you define security guarantees. Now, some are trying to define security guarantees as we would give ammunition and weapons, and which is what we're doing now. What we've been doing for the last 5 or 6 years at least. Really going back to 2014. So closer to 11, nearly 12 years. That's what some are calling security guarantees. That's not security guarantees. Security guarantees is an Article 5-like term. Remember, people are already saying that what the security guarantees that came with the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which they mock constantly and saying that was not worth the paper that it was written on, so they want something more than that. Several people I've shown you here on this channel have been making that statement. What I just described is worse or less powerful even than the Budapest Memorandum, because all it does is say we would do in the future if there's a war what we're doing right now. That's one level of security guarantees. Now, there are those who want robust teeth kind of security guarantees, i.e. Article 5-like from NATO's charter, meaning I will fight for you. Now, we know, of course, Ukraine loves that, and that's what they want. They've been trying to get it since day one. But I'm telling you the truth, because we're unintimidated and uncompromised to tell you the truth and not be nice about it, or we're not going to be mean about it either, but we're not going to dance around the edges so that people don't understand. Nobody is going to fight a war for a corrupt Ukraine that has horrific border disputes with its nuclear armed neighbor, now or later or distant future. Nobody is good. You need to understand that. This needs to be crystal clear. Not France, not the UK, not Germany, not Poland. None of those folks, not the Baltics, many of whom absolutely hate with a vile hatred Russia. They're not going to suck their country into a war against Russia for Ukraine. It's not going to happen. Trump's not going to do it. Certainly none of the other European countries are. Nobody is going to fight and die for Ukraine. Why would anyone think it's differently when you won't do it now? Why does someone imagine that in some future date you're going to get something more than a Budapest Memorandum type security guarantee that then countries would honor? I mean, it would be suicidal. It would be the height of foolishness. And if somehow somebody did sign up for that, maybe some on bilateral basis, the chances that Ukraine would then feel like, yeah, I got some powerful guys in my pocket this time. Now it's not just me. Now you're going to get a little bit more frisky, and you may prompt and provoke Russia even more than already happened back in 2021 and 2022, prior to this war getting started, or from 2014 up to 2022. Because there was a lot of military activity. I know that's not talked about much in the West, but there was a lot of military activity from the Ukraine armed forces against their own people in the eastern part of the country. That happened before. And it happened right on the eve of Russia starting on the 24th of February. I think it was, I want to say it was on maybe the 18th of February, somewhere between the 18th and the 24th. There was substantial increase in artillery attacks from the Ukraine side against the what was then called the rebel side. So Russia's not going to just be passive about that and say, all right, we're going to allow something like this to continue again, and we're going to get into something, and we're going to allow this side this time to have security guarantees. So if Ukraine did that with no security guarantees, then what do you think they would do at some point in the future when they may get stronger or something like that, if they have these security guarantees, or at least they think they do? Russia's not going to find out. That's a theoretical situation and a hypothetical situation, which Russia is almost certainly never going to find out. And we'll talk about more on the Russian aspect of this afternoon, but it just stands to reason that they're not going to do that. Looking through, so that's security guarantees. We could almost camp out right there and say this is not going to work. We can also talk about the territorial issues, which I will get to in a second. But first of all, let's look at the Trump is saying, was asked about this ceasefire, because Zelensky is is looking for an unconditional ceasefire, allegedly to do some elections, but he still wants this unconditional ceasefire from the Russian side so that he can do elections and stuff. And Trump was asked about that.
Did Putin agree to a ceasefire to allow a referendum to take?
Not a ceasefire. And that's one of the points that we're working on right now. No, not a ceasefire. He feels that, look, they're fighting and to stop, and then if they have to start again, which is a possibility, he doesn't want to be in that position. I understand that position. The president feels strongly about that or something, but I think we're finding ways that we can get around that. But I understand President Putin from that standpoint.
That's interesting that he says that. Yeah, I understand Putin from that standpoint. That's obviously a result of the phone calls he's had from Putin. I mean, we're going really all the way back to the beginning, but certain of the administration, but definitely in Anchorage, Alaska, because Russia keeps mentioning several times, even in recent days, that they keep bringing that up, saying that we made very clear to President Trump in Anchorage, Alaska, what our positions are on all these issues that they've been talking about since June 2024. That's one of the big ones. There will be no ceasefire. They have never said anything besides that. So when people keep saying in the West, and by the way, this is an intentional misinformation or deception, because they're trying to make it sound like there's something unusual about what Russia's doing with its continued attacks in the air and on the ground as we're still trying to talk for negotiations. It says that proves that Russia doesn't want peace. No, that proves that Russia means what it says. And if you're willing to listen to what they say, you'll see that they said, we will have a negotiation. We will discuss things while we fight. We will not have a negotiated settlement that happens in an unconditional ceasefire. They said in their interpretation of things, that's what happened with the Minsk Accords. They said that there was an agreement that they supported on the what was then the rebel side in the eastern part of Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk. They said they agreed to a ceasefire so that they could do the negotiations, which led to the Minsk Accords, which, of course, according to the Russian view of things, that's what led to 2024, because the Western side took that advantage of the ceasefire to build up the Ukraine armed forces, to allow them to have a more robust military to build them up for a future fight. And they said, we're never going to do that again. You can disagree with that. Doesn't make any difference. That's what Russia believes. And therefore, that's what they're going to act on. And as I keep telling you on these issues, if you have the power to compel compliance on the other side, then that means you can do it. It matters what you can do and what you can't do. And if you can say, I don't want to do this and I don't like it, but if you don't have the power to compel compliance on the other side, then your opinions are meaningless. It just doesn't matter. I'm telling you the way it really is, folks. Whether anybody likes it or not, I'm unconcerned about that at the moment, because we keep clinging to these desires we have to see an outcome beneficial to the Kiev side, detached from actual reality. And detached from those realities, then it bears repeating, the war doesn't give a damn about anyone's morality, mine, yours, Russia's, Ukraine, Europe's. It doesn't care about any of that. All it cares about is what can be done and what can't be done. Now, morality is vitally important for culture, for civilization, and it should animate our actions. But when it comes to war, when it comes to physical conflict, you need to understand it matters what you can do and what you can't do. And you can't force compliance on somebody that's stronger than you are, that can compel compliance to their view. And if you ignore that reality, then you have what we see here, which is year after year of destruction of Ukraine and the deaths of their citizens. You can keep going that way if you want, and then you'll be guaranteeing, if you're looking for guarantees, this is one, you're going to lose more territory and more men and the eventual destruction of your country. Now, let's get to some of the more interesting issues and some of the bigger conflicts. I mentioned this about ceasefire, et cetera. I want to show you two things. First, from the United States, and second, from Europe, how the thinking is so twisted and distorted. And this is part of the reason why it is so hard to reach a negotiated settlement on what should be self-evident ground truth reality. First of all, I'm going to show you, this is a double shot here. This is an Ambassador William Taylor. So you can see from America's diplomatic corps how there is a grotesque misunderstanding of how war even works. But equally so, you can tell from the way this question is posed by CNN that so-called elite media people also don't understand.
So we hear that Zelensky is insisting that a deal must have a ceasefire first. We hear the president insisting there isn't a need for a ceasefire in this war to bring it to an end. But we know toward the end of the Israel-Hamas war, one senior White House official told the Washington Post President Trump was using, quote, maximum pressure on Israel to accept a ceasefire and hostage deal to end the war. Why do you think the president was willing to use maximum pressure to get a ceasefire in that conflict, but not this one?
You've answered that in the question. That is, in order to get the war to end, in order to stop all the damage that Putin and the Russians are doing, Putin needs to decide. And Putin will decide when President Trump puts pressure on him. And you're right. President Trump knows how to put maximum pressure to get a ceasefire. That's what happened in the Middle East. That's what needs to happen in Ukraine.
To me, that is spectacular in a negative sense. That you, CNN, and you, Ambassador Taylor, are both genuinely trying to compare Trump's maximum pressure on Israel to accomplish something that Trump wanted in Hamas is equivalent to Trump putting pressure on Putin. Like it's the same. Hey, he put pressure on Bibi Netanyahu. Bibi Netanyahu did what he wanted there. He can do the same to Russia. He's just choosing not to. That's the implication, that Trump is just choosing not to put pressure on Putin. Maybe he likes Putin more than he likes Netanyahu. Do you see how insane that is to even say out loud? But if it's needed, let me go down and explain why that is. President Trump had leverage over Netanyahu. Netanyahu doesn't fire essentially, he doesn't fire one missile, one bomb, or fly an aircraft unless he has support from the United States. He requires the missiles that are fired, the bombs that are dropped, the resources that are necessary to keep planes in the air, et cetera, all kinds of other ammunition, and the wherewithal to keep war going. They would run dry in a very short period of time if the president of the United States ever stopped the support of military and financial to Israel. They don't have the capacity to produce or even purchase all that they need in terms of ammunition and weapons. Therefore, and of course, you can also add in also the diplomatic cover, which the United States gave just carte blanche diplomatic cover to anything that the Israeli side wanted to do, which protected it from all this censure from all over the world that it was otherwise getting and would otherwise have gotten a lot worse had it not been for the United States. That's the leverage that Trump had on Netanyahu. So as much as Netanyahu and AIPAC and several other folks, love to support the United States elections and candidates and politicians, et cetera, and the influence they have in the media and in the special resources, other kinds of media, all of those things. Trump has the ace in that deck. He can play it. Let's look over here. There's no deck here. I don't think Trump even has a couple of twos, much less the ace in the deck. Putin makes his own ammunition. He gets some. Also, he gets help from China. He gets help from North Korea. He gets help from Iran. But by and large, their mainstay is domestic. They have the natural resources. They have the manpower. They have the intellectual capacity. They have the industrial capacity. They can sustain. If everything went to hell, and even China said, we're not going to do anything with you anymore, Russia still has the capacity to keep going indefinitely with their own domestic resources they have. Where is Trump going to have any leverage over that? Netanyahu was an ally of the United States. Would you consider, under any definition, that Russia is an ally of the United States, that we have economic pressure that we can put on them that hasn't been tried yet, or any other kind of pressure? Do you see? This is so absurd and insane. The implication that the United States can just put pressure on Putin to stop doing something that is in his national interest. And this is not like Israel that was fighting Hamas, which is a bunch of guys basically with rifles and a couple of homemade rockets. They have Katyusha rockets. That's about it. That's all they had to worry about. They were basically driven into the holes in the ground. They would come up periodically. That's it. That's not what's going on in the Russia-Ukraine war. They have a complete, total army and air defense, drone warfare, and then 50 nations backing them, etc. So this is something close to a peer-on-peer war with all of the modern accoutrements that go along with it here. And you want to equate this to this. That is either malpractice or it's intentional misinformation. I don't know which it is. It's unknown. I can't crawl into his head. I don't have any access to the ambassador. I don't know why CNN would be saying this, but all I know is what's being said out loud. So all we can go by is what they say. And what they say is so far detached from reality, it just beggars belief. And of course, most Americans, or many Americans anyway, are listening to these reports, and that's what they hear. They don't know. They may not think about these things I just mentioned here, and they're just going to be sitting there thinking, well, yeah, I mean, why isn't Trump doing that? And of course, that's the intent. That's what people want. These kinds of people want to put pressure on Trump, not on Zelensky, not on Putin. They want to put pressure on Trump to do something that's irrational. They want him to act as irrational as they are, which, as I keep telling you, means that ultimately they want the Ukraine side to die. They want their people to die, and they want their country to lose. That will be the result if Trump gives in to what they want to do. But they're not the only one. William Taylor, CNN. Let's now go over to an alleged military expert in the UK who also went on today, and he was saying that actually, as it turns out, Putin is the one who's confused.
I think it's true that Putin is a bit confused and a bit over-optimistic about the military situation. Putin keeps making these maximalist demands. He seems to think that he's winning this war, whereas in fact, Russia, in 12 years of fighting, has only managed to occupy 20% of Ukraine. And in the last year alone, it's occupied around 1% of Ukrainian territory at the cost of losing hundreds of thousands of troops dead and seriously wounded. Putin seems to think that he's winning the war, and his advisors presumably are telling him that. But actually, Ukraine's doing very well.
Lies.
Okay. Wow. If I had a lot of harsh things to say about Ambassador Taylor, what in the world could I say about this guy who comes off and purports to be a military expert? Ukraine is doing really well. That is just stunning in the extreme. That Russia's not doing well. even though, as I've told you in recent episodes here with Stepnogorsk, Gulyapolya, Mirnograd, Rodinska, all have fallen in the last 3 or 4 days after have been all have fallen. The one place that Ukraine tried to do a counterattack in the Kupiansk, they are still not able to drive Russia all the way out of that. And it's a very short period of time. That's also going to reverse just because Ukraine doesn't have the manpower, just like it was guaranteed that their incursion into Kursk was going to backfire and they were going to lose everything. It's the same thing here because there's just too many Russian troops. It's just simple as that. It's a war of attrition, not a battle. But yet here he's trying to convince all of the leaders. If CNN was trying to talk about listeners in America, here's the Times of London trying to convince listeners in UK that, yeah, just keep going. Again, he said that he lies about some things. He said Russia has been fighting this for 11 or 12 years. They haven't. There has been a civil war in Ukraine from 2014 to 2022. In those 8 years, that was supplied in large measure by the West. They never want to mention that part. Massive support from the West. And then the rebels in that fight were supported and supplied by Russia. Russia was not fighting in that war, just like the West was not fighting in the war. It was a proxy war that both the external powers were in. That's what happened for 8 years of that. This war, however, has been going on for 4 years. So let's at least talk about this in an accurate way. And it's true on the map, 1% has been lost in the last year or so. But what is also true on the map is that the Russians have now accelerated their territorial acquisitions, and they're moving faster and faster to the west, taking territory on a much, much more compressed timeline. And as more important than all that is that on this same 2-year period, the number of casualties Russia has inflicted on Ukraine is astronomical, a wound from which they cannot recover. Russia, whoever you want to believe about the casualties that have been infected on the Russian side, there have been some. There have been a lot, but a lot is a term that no one can define. Many on the West say it's been 1.5 million. There's no way for us to know for sure what the right is. Logic says that it's probably a fraction of that, but it's a pretty healthy fraction. So let's just, for the sake of argument, let's say that the West is, on this point, telling you the truth, and it's 1.5 million. That, when we know that the Russian military active duty is 1.5 million today, and I'm not sure how much larger it's supposed to get in 2026. I haven't heard that. But as of the end of this month, it's going to be at 1.5 million active troops. It was 990 some odd thousand total active forces on February 24th, 2022. What that tells you is that the Russian army has grown by 500,000, despite whatever all these casualties that are being alleged. They've grown 500,000 since that time. We know for sure from the Ukrainians' own side that they do not have enough manpower to offset their losses. They can't force mobilize enough people. Russia, other than the one partial mobilization they did in 2022, has never resorted to it since because they haven't had to. They have grown it 500,000 by recruiting. So it's so far from being a crisis that they haven't even started to mobilize. If they start to mobilize, if it gets serious, they can bring in several million people. Because unlike the Ukrainians, a lot of the people that they have trained and brought on for a period of time over the years, they demobilized them. They go back to their civilian lives. And they still have 1.5 million. So there is no possibility that you're going to win a war of attrition against a side that has millions more men and a virtual unending supply of natural resources and an industrial capacity that you can never match on this side, because only the Ukraine side is at full mobilization in their industry. Nobody else in the West. The West has increased some, but only marginally so. Russia is also in an existential fight, so they substantially increased their capacity. And they're now on a level they can sustain at a high rate almost indefinitely for an extended period of time with no problem. So why would you want to get into a war of attrition with that side? Why would you want to keep waging a war of attrition with that side? And why would you want to lie to your population and tell them Putin is not doing well, but the Ukraine side is, when it's self-evident that they're not? Every metric proves it. I'm talking about metrics from the Ukraine side. But yet that's what passes for European and Western elite these days. It just boggles the mind to see that these kinds of things can be said and no one pushes back. Well, no one other than us. One real quick, the last topic I want to talk about here, because it's also very central to this whole discussion here, as though everything I've already told you isn't already enough mountains to try and overcome. It's the issue of the Donbass in particular. That's kind of what was at the heart of this. That's what started this whole issue. That's where even the civil war was fought in the Donbass, and where now then the central issue is. And you heard Zelensky at the top of the show here talk about, no, this, 87% of the people don't want to give up the Donbass, and so they're not willing to. So that's his position here. President Trump was asked, what is your position on the Donbass?
Some mixed signals coming from Moscow, even after you spoke with President Putin, telling that Ukraine has to give up Donbass.
Well, that's what they've been asking for, and there's a dispute about that. So they're going to have to iron that out. That's an issue they have to iron out. But I think it's moving in the right direction.
They're going to have to iron that out, and they're moving in the right direction. Are they, though? Are the sides moving in the right direction? Because you see Zelensky on this episode at the top of the show said, we're not going to do that. We're not even interested in doing that. I showed you this just about a week or so ago, maybe a little bit less than a week ago, at the Federation Council. President Putin, by name, specified the Donbass is an irrevocable part of the Russian Federation. So you see their sides are moving in the opposite direction. They're hardening away. So I don't know what you're talking about when you say it's moving in the right direction. It's not. Maybe you wish that it would. It's not. And, some things you got to iron out. The things you got to iron out is both sides are saying that they're going to take the Donbass. Ukraine says even the parts that they still possess, they're not going to get rid of. And the Russian side says, we're taking all of it one way or another, and they have the power to do so. There's not a lot to iron out there. There's just either you acknowledge reality or you're going to lose it. It's really that simple. And unfortunately, it's not just Zelensky. Here on LBC Radio, there was an interview with Kira Riddick, who is a member of the Ukraine parliament, who certainly backed up President Zelensky's claim.
If Zelensky came back from one of these meetings and said, look, we've got to accept that Russia is not going to give up its claims in the Donbass, what would the reaction of the Ukrainian people be to that?
It will be a very negative reaction. Basically, that's why President Zelensky is not agreeing to give up on Ukraine's territory. First thing is because then he will be politically done. And second is because he simply doesn't have the rights according to Ukrainian constitution.
So, that's from the parliament. That matches what Jennifer said on our show a little bit ago, Jennifer Kavanaugh. That's what she said after she came back from Ukraine. She said she was privately told that the Ukrainian Rada would not support it. And here's this member of the Rada validating that. We're not going to do it. The people wouldn't do it. Zelensky doesn't have the order to do it. So she is inflected by the same malady that Zelensky and the Europeans are. She sees what she wants. She sees what she describes as fair and unfair and says, no, we're not going to do it. And I cannot more firmly and painfully tell you and exclaim, if you hold that position, if Zelensky holds his position, you will lose not just the remainder of the Donbass, but you will lose much more. Almost certainly, in my view, whenever that may take, even if it did take another couple of years, they can do it. The Russians can do it. You'll lose probably everything to the Dnieper River up to Kiev, everything. And almost certainly, I can't even imagine a scenario where Russia would not take Odessa and shut off and control all of the Black Sea fleet, Black Sea access. That's what you're going to win by having this just and lasting position. So whether it's Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, Friedrich Merz, Mark Rutte, Ursula von der Leyen, or this member of the parliament here, Volodymyr Zelensky, you guys can all hold that position all day long. You can wrap your arms around each other and hold hands and show this position of unity. You can get not 95%, you can get 100% agreement on your side. And all you're going to do is guarantee that Russia will not stop until it's taken all of this territory. That's where we're at. I'm just telling you the hard truth here. These are the unpleasant truths that for some reason nobody on mainstream media wants to talk about. And it's one thing not to talk about it, but it's another thing to misinform people on their shows to make them believe that there's a choice that can be made. All Trump has to do is decide he's going to put pressure on Putin. All Zelensky has to do is decide he's not going to give up the Donbass, and that a just and lasting peace, according to Keir Starmer, will somehow be the result. It won't. It won't. And history is going to be just vicious on these people. All those names I just mentioned are all going to be going down in history as those who together led to the destruction of the Ukraine. And a lot more is going to go along with that. There's virtually no rational way it can be any way else. That's the truth of it. One last thing I do want to talk about here today, because Trump mentioned something, and he did say something that I think is accurate and that we should listen to. One of the last things he was asked is, especially in light of all these concessions that are required from the Ukraine side, especially as it returns to Donbass, what if there is no agreement and the war continues on?
President Trump, I know you've sounded an optimistic note here, but what happens in a few weeks if things sputter? What are you prepared to do?
They keep fighting, and they keep dying. No good. But if things don't happen, they keep fighting, and they keep dying. And we don't want that to happen. He doesn't want it to happen. President Putin doesn't want it to happen either.
Well, I guess he doesn't really want it to happen, Zelensky, when Trump motioned over to him. But he is laying the foundation for it. The hardest thing for him to do, because of the significant political headwinds that would be against him, especially in the Rada, the hard right in Ukraine is very well known as being adamantly opposed to any concessions whatsoever to Russia. Anybody's talking about peace. There has been a lot of credible reporting that Zelensky would be killed by his own people if he did that. I don't discount that well may be true, and that it's a pressure he would have to worry about. And I still say it doesn't matter. He has to do it. If the risk of your own life to do the right thing is the price, then the leader of the country must do that. Because to say, I'm not going to go against the political headwinds and I'm not going to risk my life by going against these far right people who have power in my country, I'm just going to let the war continue going on until eventually Russia's soldiers do what they're going to do. Then you are, by not being willing to put your own life at risk, you are being willing to guaranteed sacrifice tens and possibly hundreds, thousands more of your own countrymen's death in the eventual loss of your sovereign territory, access to the sea, which goes along with it, all your future prosperity possibilities. That's where we're at, folks. Trump is right in that regard. If there's no agreement that comes, if we just waffle on, then the killing will continue on, the fighting will continue on, and the losses will keep stacking up. That's where we are. That's the hard truth of it. So while a lot of people want to have optimistic comments here that here was, there's a chance for peace, that maybe we're 90% of the way, we're not. We weren't 90% of the way there when Trump met with Zelensky in February. We were 90% of the way there when Trump met with Zelensky, met with Putin in Anchorage, Alaska, when this 28-point peace plan came out, when this 20-point peace plan came out, when this meeting here now at Mar-a-Lago, none of it's true. We're not 90% of the way anywhere. Nobody that matters has moved. Ukraine has not moved. Russia has not moved. The only thing that moves is the front line and the stacking of body counts. That does move. And it's going to continue going in the direction it's been going until either sanity prevails on the West and they do the hard right thing, or they keep with this fantasy and this fiction and they lose it all. That's your options. Now, we're going to have a show later this afternoon at 2 o'clock with Andrei Martyanov from Russia to Ukraine, withdrawal from the Donbass. That's another firm statement made by the Russian side. And that's what we're going to talk about this afternoon. We didn't talk about any of the Russian views on any of these things or any of their statements.
to cede territory that we've previously claimed in order to bring an end to this. No, didn't say that at all. What he said the day before was, no way in hell, we're not giving up a damn piece of territory. So, okay, they're not giving up any territory. The Russians have made it clear they demand the 5 former oblasts, Crimea, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Luhansk. That's Russian territory. Russians have not backed off on that 1 inch. So what you have here is a fundamental disagreement that's not going to be resolved by talking. It's not a matter of, oh, they just don't understand what our position is. No, both sides understand the positions. The Ukrainians and Zelensky continue to believe that somehow they can retake or regain control of those territories, or they can stop Russia in its tracks. It's not going to happen. And this, I watch with fascination this media attention to nothing. I mean, they acted like something was actually happening of substance. Yeah, Zelensky and his team, they showed up at Mar-a-Lago and they spent 2.5 hours talking. But when it was all said and done, the Ukrainians are going, okay, yeah, we're going to have to make some territorial concessions to Russia now in order to bring this to an end. They're not interested in bringing it to an end. It's a money-making machine, for God's sake.
Yeah. But Larry, what is the issue with European Union and European countries? Basically, I don't know if you read the support from Germany to Ukraine has reduced drastically. Mm-hmm. But after all, you don't see that sort of change in their behavior in Ukraine. And if the support is not the way it was before, how you can continue with the same sort of behavior?
Well, I guess you're proceeding from the assumption that the Europeans have learned something from history or even know anything about history. They have, completely divorced themselves from reality, I guess, is the best way to describe it. Friedrich Merz, Emmanuel Macron, Keir Starmer, these 3 leaders are, I think, their combined popular support, if you add up all of their support, they're still less than 50%. I mean, they're in low double digits, each of them in their particular countries. They do not reflect the will of the voters, of the citizens of those countries, but they are committed to keeping this war going. From Mertz's standpoint, he's obligated more by BlackRock. BlackRock, made an investment. Even though it's not overtly apparent, but somehow they've got to salvage. His marching orders are salvage the situation for BlackRock, and we saw. What was crazy was it 2 weeks ago now they had a meeting in D.C. and who shows up at that meeting? BlackRock. Larry Fink. What the hell are you doing here? Because supposedly you don't have any money invested. You don't have nothing at risk. I don't think that's true. So, this fundamentally right now, what we're talking about is money and control. The West trying to figure out how it can retain some, piece of that pie in Ukraine. But Russia is the situation on the ground militarily is such that Europe cannot halt the Russian advance. And the Ukrainians are losing. It's just that simple.
And the situation on the battlefield somehow shows in all directions they're advancing. Larry.
Yes. Along with Ukraine, Ukraine and the West keep up the propaganda flow. They claimed that they had retaken Kupiansk and driven the Russians out, and a lot of Telegram channels got all exercised about it, but. Andrei, our mutual friend Andrei Martyanov, did a good video the other day, just ripping that apart. The The fact of the matter is, Ukraine does not have the reserve military forces that it can deploy wherever there is a need. They have limited resources. And so when they go to plug one gap in the line, the Russians accelerate the attacks in another section of the battle lines. And, it's just going to continue. People are talking about, maybe in 6 months, the Russians will be, at Zaporizhia on the Dnieper River. I think it's going to happen a lot quicker. You're going to see a more rapid collapse of the Ukrainian army over the next 3 to 4 weeks.
Yeah, we have today's December 29. It seems that the 2025 is over, and we still have the conflict in Ukraine. The way that Donald Trump is talking about the conflict and putting all together European, he said that the security guarantees to Ukraine and major part of the security, considering Ukraine, comes from the European countries. Is not going to.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a waste of time. We can talk about it. The Europeans, they think they're going to be able to put together some sort of European force that will go into Ukraine and say, okay, to the Russians, if you attack the Ukrainians, you're going to have to come through us. Russia will not allow that. That's not going to happen. That will escalate the war into an actual full-blown war. If the Europeans think they're going to do that, but the problem is they're Europeans. The average European, if you're talking about a citizen of France or a citizen of Germany, citizen of UK, great people, individual on an individual level, great people, but their governments suck. They are so out of touch with reality, and they think that they have military power. They do not. They're a bunch of weaklings. And if they think they're going to go in to secure Ukraine, and the ultimate, the entire concept of the security guarantee is that if, quote, Russia attacks, then they'll respond. They'll come and fight on behalf of Ukraine. Not going to happen. So this is just people indulging in a fantasy right now. They're kidding themselves.
How far Europe would go in producing arms in Europe without being, dependent on the United States? Do you see that happening?
No, they're Germany. They're all betting on Germany to save their bacon. Yeah, let's get Germany start building those weapons. Only problem is Germany's deindustrializing. Factories are closed. They closed the Volkswagen factory recently. So they're going in the wrong direction, and they did it to themselves. Along with the United States blowing up Nord Stream and cutting off the supply of natural gas, and now trying to refuse to buy oil from Russia. They want to pay higher prices. It is damaging their economy. So we've seen that across the board in Europe. They're no longer an industrial center of power. They were 110 years ago. Yeah, you could make the case there was some significant industrial capabilities, manufacturing capabilities in Europe. No longer. Yeah, the French got Airbus and they can build some planes, but it's all going the wrong direction.
Trump said that Rubio, Hexet, Witkoff, Kushner, together with General Keane, they will join a U.S. working group on.
Did you say General Keane or Kane?
General, it's Keane, Keane.
No, not him. Kane, Raising Kane. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
As I read it, it seems that it's General Keane. Anyway,
no, they can't.
Keane. I don't know if that's right.
Well, yeah, I don't. I have no doubt that what you're reading.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
Keane, remember General Keynes.
It's impossible. I know because I see him on Fox every time he comes up with.
He's with the Institute for the Study of War. I think what I heard when Trump talked about who his negotiating team would be, he said General Kane.
Kane.
K-C-A-I-N-E. Raisin that, Raisin Kane, they call him. That, but again, this I can't see them sending all of those over to be, quote, the negotiating team with Russians. We'll see if that even happens. They're talking about that now. But the problem remains Ukraine. And Ukraine is losing on the battlefield. And Russia's not going to get suckered in again like they did with Minsk II, where they said, okay, we'll stop in place because we got all these Europeans saying that they back this peace process. No, it's not going to. I can't emphasize enough, people. Go read what Vladimir Putin said to the Russian Foreign Ministry on June 14th, 2024, and what he has repeated, multiple times since then. What has been restated by Sergei Lavrov, what's been stated by the Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Rybkov. They haven't changed. And that's why I sit here and get just terribly frustrated watching a lot of commentators. Oh, yeah, this is an advance. The peace process is moving. Maybe Russia's willing to make some concessions. No, they're not. They're not. Well, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin had a good phone call. Great. Glad they had a nice conversation. Doesn't mean that the Russians are saying, "Oh, okay, now, yeah, we'll stop where we are in place. We'll no longer continue to advance militarily in Kherson or Zaporizhia, and we'll give some of that territory back to Ukraine." Not gonna happen. And the West continues to, deceive itself, lie to itself. Oh yeah, the Russian economy is going weak. Oh, the Russians are getting exhausted. They can't keep this up. Yes, they can. They're nowhere near exhaustion. They haven't even they have not mobilized for war. This is still a special military operation. And the simplest way to describe that is they have not declared anywhere approaching a full mobilization. They're maintaining and growing the size of their army through normal recruitment processes. And in fact, they used to offer, financial bonuses to get people to sign up. They're now stopping that because they got too many people showing up to say, okay, yeah, we'll go fight. And they say, that's all right. We got enough. Go back to work. So, 6% of their GDP has been can be attributed to the war effort. Only 6%. During World War II, by contrast, the U.S. GDP was like 45% was devoted to war. That's when you're up into double digits and approaching 50%, that's when you're at war, full blown war. Russia's not anywhere near that.
I remember when the war started, Michael McFaul said that this is the Putin's war. And today we cannot, it's obvious what's going on in the society, within the society in Russia. The people are even more, they want to be more forceful toward what's going on in Ukraine in terms of, against the West. You see somehow the Russian president, trying to do something in the middle. He's not going that far, confronting, NATO and the collective West. Let's put it this way.
Yeah.
How do you see, Larry, what has happened to the Russian society? Because you remember when the war started, the media has convinced that some young Russian, boys to get out of Russia, not stay there and fighting for Russia, because that was Putin's war. That was a war of aggression. That is not the case anymore, even with the more liberal part of the society.
Look, I've only been to Russia times in the last 2 years.
Yeah, that's a
Um,
lot.
yeah, so
You know a lot then.
what do I know? What I have not observed protests against the war. I have not heard, meeting with. I've met with a variety of people. I'm not just locked into one group. Um, the issue of the war doesn't really come up much because it's not a war. It's a special military operation right now. That's how the society is organized, and what that means is that the average consumer, the average Russian, is not having to make a sacrifice to forego, food or to be limited with coupons for buying gas. You go back to what happened in the United States during World War II. Nobody could buy a new car for like 3 or 4 years. No new cars. They were limited. You got ration coupons for how much gas you could buy. There are restrictions. You don't see that in Russia. Yeah, and now you're correct. There are some segments of Russian society that want Putin to really take the gloves off and just beat the living hell out of Ukraine. And you've heard that articulated sometimes by the likes of Medvedev, the former Russian president. But there is not this surge of I guess anger or irritation that they're saying, okay, we got to move quicker. Putin is relying upon the general staff for the war plan, how they're proceeding with the war. And, do they make mistakes? Yes, they've made mistakes. I'm not at all arguing that the Russian military is perfect, but, they seem to be handling business pretty well. And they have proceeded. I've not been privy to their plans. So I have to assume they know what they're doing and what they're trying to accomplish. As I've said before, one of the things that has been a limiting factor on the performance of the Russian military was because it's not a war, because they did not mobilize on a wartime footing, they've relied on a slower process for building up the actual number of men in the army. And that has, as that number has risen, their operations and activities have increased. That's why this year we're seeing, far more rapid advances than any time in the previous 3 years. And I think that's only going to continue. It's not going to subside.
I think that shows how the Russian army has been transforming, somehow a defensive army. They were prepared to defend themselves, but they were not prepared to attack any other, to go outside of Russia to fight, something like NATO, 700,000 soldiers in Ukraine. They were fighting a huge force in Ukraine. But as you've mentioned, it shows how they have been trained. They have been training during the process of war in Ukraine. And Russia today is their army is totally different.
Well,
right?
yeah.
I don't know if. Go ahead.
Well,
Go ahead.
I lost you were talking and your voice disappeared.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, no.
I'm talking about the transformation of the Russian army.
Well, when the special military operation started in February 2022, the Russian ground forces were estimated at 275,000 total. And they only deployed about half of that into the initial incursion into Ukraine. They had reserves at the time, I want to say 800, 900,000 or, ready reserves. But actually the numbers, I guess they in theory could have called upon 3 to 5 million. Well, they didn't do that. By September 2022, they mobilized 320,000. Now, here we are coming up on the fourth year of this war. Their army has grown to around 1.5 million. So it's increased by a factor of, almost 7 times the size of what it was 4 years ago. Now, bringing people in means you don't just immediately, like the Ukrainians are doing, put a uniform on them, shove them to the front lines. The Russians do have the luxury of time to train these people. In fact, I was just reading that one of the problems they've got right now is they've got so many people wanting to sign up, wanting to enlist. They don't have enough training grounds available, enough bases where they could absorb all those new trainees. So, Russia's not suffering. They're not suffering losses in manpower. They're not suffering losses in terms of their ability to produce weapons. They're not suffering losses in terms of shortages of energy. So basically everything you need in order to fight and sustain a war, Russia has, and Ukraine doesn't. That is, that's the fundamental issue. If you think about it, you say, okay, what do we need? Okay, we need manpower, people willing to fight. Russia has that. Ukraine doesn't. We see video after video of Ukrainian, recruiters going out and tackling people and dragging them into cars. You need to have an industrial base that can provide what you need for the war effort. Russia has that, and they haven't even had to go onto a war footing. In other words, what exists within the civilian economy is still sufficient to keep them supplied with weapons and ammunition and new vehicles, new tanks, new planes, etc. The people have to be willing to support the war effort. You have that in Russia. It's questionable how far that extends in Ukraine. There are some reports that the people still believe that they can win this war. So they're victims of their own propaganda. Russia has all of the factors you need in order to sustain the war effort. Ukraine, without Western support, does not. It's that simple.
On the part of NATO, how did you find, Larry, all these weapons, different type of weapons going to Ukraine? It shows something, the weapons are not integrated into the system that was exposed in Ukraine somehow. I don't know if that's of concern for NATO.
Well, again, when Russia builds weapons, they are built in, I guess, according to let's call it a national security strategy. They actually do have a genuine national security strategy, and the whole military industrial system in Russia is not a capitalist system. It's not one where these industries exist in order to earn profits for shareholders. These industries exist to make sure that Russia has what it needs to fend off foreign attacks. It has been the philosophy behind it. Whereas when you get into the West, the various companies that build tanks and planes and cannons, artillery pieces and artillery shells, these are all capitalist companies. They're not they're publicly owned, or they serve shareholders, and those shareholders want returns. So the weapons that end up being designed, developed, and deployed are not necessarily weapons that serve a national security strategy. And then because of how NATO is with 31 countries now, the industry in Germany does things in one way, the industry in France does things in another way, and the same with the UK. So there's no coherent focus It's not like they're all producing something to a particular standard. They have different standards, different capabilities. So it's just, this Europe is not in the position that, let's go back to 1930 as Hitler comes to power and Hitler starts rebuilding the German army. They had, at the time in Germany, they had idle factories. They had workers that were looking for a job. Today in Germany, they got a problem with energy. They can't produce. They're shuttering factories, and a lot of those factories are moving overseas. So they don't right now have the capability in place to produce on a footing that would really build up the army in a dramatic fashion. And frankly, Russia's monitoring that too. Russia's not going to sit back and allow these countries to rearm on the scale of like what Germany did in the 1930s, because the Russians are legitimately concerned that Europe keeps talking about attacking Russia. They keep treating Russia as if it's an enemy.
Yeah, without arms, they're talking about preemptive attacks on Russia. So just imagine if they produce new arms. But Larry, let me shift the gear a little bit to what's going on with the meeting, with the upcoming meeting between the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump. It's in Washington Post reported that Netanyahu is going to press U.S. President during the meeting, and because he wants to attack Iran.
Yeah. Well, you saw so I wrote a piece 2 days ago based on a headline in the New York Post where it said, Iran declares war on the United States, Israel, and Europe. And I went, hey, that's unusual. Then you actually read the article. It was Pezeshkian was being interviewed. I forget which media outlet, but he said, "Look, we're effectively at war with Israel, the United States, and the West. We're not looking for a fight, but they're attacking us." He was simply acknowledging the situation, but instead, here's the New York Post, which has been carrying a lot of water for the Zionists, saying, "Oh, see, those Iranians, they're declaring war on us, so we got to be able to go attack them." This was put out, 2 days before, this was done on Saturday. So, Netanyahu arrives today. And I'm sure Netanyahu's going to do his best to try to convince Trump, we need to go take another whack at those Iranians. They're serious about it. And the New York Post was being used, I think, by Zionist sources because the publishers of that newspaper, they're very close with the Israelis, and they carry water for Israeli propaganda. So, they're trying to create the impetus to see if they can get Trump on board. And frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if Trump will tell Netanyahu, "Okay, we'll see what we can do," and that they will try at some point to try to attack Iran again. Only this time, I think Iran is ready in a way that it was not last June.
And you feel it, you see it when you're here in Iran. And I don't know, Larry, when it comes to, they were talking about Iran's nuclear program. Right now, they're talking about missile facilities.
Right.
So this is so ridiculous how far they would go, because that's impossible. I would say, Larry, here you see in the media talking with officials, you cannot believe that anything of what Netanyahu is asking for would happen anytime soon. If they go that far, we're going to have a full-out war between the two.
Yeah. Well, that's why Iran, after the attack, the 12-day war, was it June 13th to June 25th, sat down and realized, you know what? We need to look at our relationships with Russia and China in a new light. Previously, Iran resisted getting too far embedded militarily with either Russia or China, but not now. I've been jokingly referring to how they're racking up frequent flyer miles, all the Iranian officials that keep traveling back and forth to Moscow and to Beijing. And it's people from the foreign ministry, people from the Ministry of Defense. It's not just one or two meetings. It's there's frequent contact. So Iran now is militarily, economically, and politically in a much stronger position than it was on June 12th of 2025. And if Israel is stupid enough to try to go ahead and attack Iran, thinking that they're going to defeat Iran and force a collapse of society, they may actually end up doing the same to themselves. Because I think Iran is in a much stronger position now to retaliate.
And you follow the Israeli media. They're talking about what would happen in the aftermath of Netanyahu's, administration. It seems that Netanyahu is gonna be, somehow, I don't know how possible is that to have someone in Israel replacing Netanyahu, because after all, and how influential that would be considering the foreign policy of Israel.
Well, I don't see any. They get rid of Netanyahu. He is gifted in terms of knowing how to manipulate U.S. Opinion and then to get the support from the United States. But in terms of the policies he's pursuing, there's a majority of Israelis that support this. So it's not like a Netanyahu's pushing a policy that the majority of the Israelis reject. It's just the opposite. They embrace it. They just don't like Netanyahu personally, and he is corrupt. But Netanyahu goes, there's still. I don't see Israel changing course at all.
But after all, you remember the 12 days of war, which was so, short. Many people getting out of Israel, which wasn't the case, by the way, here in Iran.
Well, right.
So a country of the size of 80, 90, 91 million people, they're not leaving the country. They're somehow unifying from within. And you see in Israel, people getting out, to Cyprus, other countries. So, it doesn't.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure how much. There were a number that left around that period. I don't know if any have come back, or if they continue to abandon Israel. The threat of war does, I think, may be an incentive for some. The problem is you got these settlers that they continue to try to steal land from the Palestinians, and the latest action over the last month, the government of Israel has authorized and approved more theft, and so they're like a ravenous locust. They keep consuming, destroying, and unfortunately for the Palestinians, while they get some lip service from a lot of countries, there has been no concerted international action to try to stop Israel.
For such a long time, Larry, Israel was attacking Lebanon, Syria, Gaza, West Bank, and they were somehow immune from the attacks from outside. Somehow, I'm talking about. But you see, during the war with Iran, they have experienced something different, something that they haven't before. So I think that is still the case for the decision makers in Israel. Do they really want to experience a larger war with Iran? And how is that going to influence them? and their society.
Well, I mean, when you're assuming that they sit down and rationally weigh out, do an accurate assessment of Iranian capabilities. I don't think they're doing that. So they underestimate Iran's capabilities. They overestimate their own capabilities. And then, when you act on those kinds of beliefs, you can do some really stupid things. So, as I was saying, I think last week when we talked, Israel has extended itself in a way that I think is making it weaker, not stronger. It's one thing to activate, and I think they mobilized about 300,000 reservists for the Gaza operation. Well, they're only a country of 8 million people, 7 million people now. So they don't have unlimited manpower resources. They've got very limited resources. And that 300,000 man army has been incapable and unable to defeat Hamas. And they got Hamas confined to a 350 square kilometer area. And they've got them surrounded on all sides, but Israel hasn't been able to, defeat Hamas in that sense. And then they're conducting military operations in Lebanon and in Syria. So they've got, there is a limit to what they can do militarily. And they don't seem to appreciate their limitations. They're acting as if they got unlimited resources. And I just, what's come out in the last 24 hours, Department of Defense Inspector General's report, there's like almost $8 billion in weapons missing. The United States has provided a bunch of aid, but they don't know where it's gone. So they're missing $8 billion, which is a sizable chunk of money.
Larry, a little bit talking about the situation with China. It seems that China is getting so much nervous about the situation of Taiwan, and they're getting prepared. They're getting, ready to fight anything coming to their, as they call it, the homeland. They see,
Mm-hmm.
But do you see the United States escalating the situation in Taiwan, or somehow Donald Trump going in that direction of, sending more weapons, making new decisions on Taiwan?
Well, the weapons package that was, recently the aid provided to Taiwan, yeah, that has created greater tension with the Chinese. But I don't see China is not going to act militarily to take control of Taiwan. Not going to happen. They will do this economically. They will do this diplomatically. They don't have to get into that kind of shooting war with the West over Taiwan. It's like on the economic front, as an example, they're going to stop exporting silver. So silver is now a critical mineral in the production of some key systems around the world. And so this is going to have a dramatic impact. It's along the same lines of when they stopped shipping rare earth minerals to the United States. I see China using economic means, withholding certain products and limiting shipments of other things as a way to defeat the West, as opposed to, getting into a full-blown battle. At the same time, they're prepared to defend themselves, and they're going to assert dominance and along their immediate border in those areas just offshore. But I don't think they see the need to invade Taiwan. They're going to be able. They will win control of Taiwan ultimately through a political process.
Because after all, they're witnessing something similar to what has happened in Ukraine, sending more weapons, training the army, and looking at Ukraine, Larry, by the way, I know that Taiwan is an island, is a little island that they're not connected to any
Right.
country. That makes it hugely difficult for Taiwanese to go against China. But these are not, as you've mentioned, rational strategists or rational players. That's why China is hugely concerned about what's going on in Taiwan. And
Well, the what's made Taiwan such a hot button issue over the last 6 years are the role of NVIDIA and computer chips, and Taiwan's status as being a major producer of computer chips. China is moving in the direction of producing its own now, and so at some point, Taiwan will no longer be relevant. If the direction that China's headed right now, I think, could make the production center in Taiwan no longer as critical as it is now or has been. And actually, you see the United States as well under Trump moving to try to onshore, bring from overseas, return to the United States, the ability to produce computer chips. But I think the Chinese have finally they've awakened and said, look, the West is going to continue to try to hold us hostage economically in if we allow them to have any leverage at all. So they've actually planned and are moving and executing on that plan to make themselves independent of the West. And it's happening. And as you've had your discussions with Pepe over his recent sojourn in China, traveling the old and new Silk Road. China is, it's something new and dramatic in terms of its economic power. The West keeps banking on that China's going to collapse any minute now, and their economy sucks, and it's just we can't even objectively look in the mirror and see what we are. We're so busy, criticizing, looking for weaknesses in others. The West, I guess this economic competition, the West is lost. China has surpassed us in every category. There's nothing that the West has that China is now in need of.
No, part of their success, and I think a huge part of their success, is the way that they're treating, other countries, the way they're approaching other countries, talking with other countries. They don't put pressure. They don't go, you have to do this, do that. The domestic policy, you make some changes in your domestic policies. They want a better relationship with, different countries in Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East. But the United States has not changed its attitude.
Well,
And it doesn't seem that they're learning anything from what China is doing.
The United States, we're acting more like a couple of members, the guys from the mafia that show up at the mom and pop business and, hey, we're selling you some insurance so your business doesn't get blown up. It's a protection racket. But that's been the U.S. policy now towards other countries. They're coerced and they're threatened. Yeah, if you don't sign up with us, something bad could happen. I don't see China doing the same thing. China, particularly in Africa, when you step back and look at the role that the West, particularly Europe, played in Africa, they didn't leave it better than what they found initially. They saw it as a place to exploit, to extract resources, to create pliant governments that would do what they wanted, and not really build up infrastructure, not make sure that the people were educated, that you had good, you had power plants, you had good roads, you had good telecommunication. None of that. That's where China's coming in with this Belt and Road Initiative. It's building up that infrastructure, and they're not doing it in a way where they say, "Hey, well, we'll come do this for you, but then you owe us," to make them dependent. It's a different approach. Some will say, "Oh, Johnson, you're being naive," but what we're witnessing is China's found a different way that they're actually making good on the promise of development. When I was going to school in the 70s, 50 years ago, there was this real competition between the communist world and the capitalist world. There was a book written by Eugene Rostow, who was an economist. He'd been involved in the Kennedy administration. It was called The 5 Stages of Economic Growth. And basically it was just trying to explain how capitalism, in contrast to communism, was going to create all this wealth for these third world countries. And it never happened because, the United States was not really interested in building up the wealth of the countries in South America and in Africa in particular. We were still very much an extractive, so much, a lot of the activities of the CIA in the early days were serving the interests of corporations, whether it was United Fruit in Central America or the oil giants in Iran. That's where the CIA under, was it Kermit Roosevelt, played a big role in the overthrow of Mossadegh. And it was also about resource extraction, not building up and equipping those countries to be strong on their own.
Yeah, to those people who criticizing you about, being naive about China, but the outcomes talks for itself. The outcome is there. You cannot, you see the outcome, you see the result of their behavior, their attitude, and you have to understand why are they successful.
Well,
that's the way they're behaving.
Let's just look at what has happened to China in the last 52 years. And to the United States in the last 52 years. 52 years ago, the Chinese were not, the majority of the population were not literate. Majority of the population lived in poverty. The society was not industrialized at all. And when you look at the transformation that's taken place in China on an incredible scale, with a 1.4 billion people, to build modern cities, to make a priority of ensuring that its children are educated. Whereas, in the United States, you could go to our major cities, New York, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, particularly the minorities in those cities. They're not, they can't read at grade level. They can't do math at grade level. It's not like we're churning out great scholars. So these out of these cities, the educational institutions are hellholes. The industrial base in the United States has shrunk. It hasn't expanded. The middle class has been severely damaged. We used to have a strong working class, blue collar workers. I came out of them. As I've said before, my father was he started off working in a steel mill, and then became a maintenance foreman. He rose in position, and we were comfortable growing up. We didn't realize, in terms of now looking back at it, I had 2 sisters and a brother, and my mom and dad. We lived in a 3-bedroom house. Think about that. So I shared a bed with my younger brother. My two sisters, they shared a bedroom, and my parents had a bedroom, and we had one bathroom. But today that sounds crazy, but we got along, we survived fine. But that was my dad made enough money that he could buy a new car every couple of years. We could take a vacation. We went on vacations about every year. Nothing extravagant, but you can still load up the whole family and go. You don't have that now, not in the same level. And so here's China has surpassed the United States on almost every criteria. The United States is going backwards in terms of literacy. U.S. literacy, last numbers I saw said it was 79%, not in the 90s. It should be in the 90s. It's not. China's in the 90s. So, and yet the West continues to try to portray China and Russia as imperial powers that are bent on conquering the world, and we've got to treat them as an enemy. And because we treat them as an enemy, then when they listen to what we're saying and watch our actions and they react, we say, see, now we've proved it. And we don't take into account that we're creating that reaction. And we keep talking about an international rules-based order. Hell, we just arbitrarily make up the rules when they suit us. We follow it only when it's to our advantage and ignore it when we want to.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much, Larry, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
All right. Well, the audience is going to be clamoring and say, "Where are your shirts, Nima?" All right. Well, listen, you continue to enjoy your respite in Iran with your family. I know the grandparents, they don't care about seeing you. They're just glad to have the grandkids around.
Exactly. That's the case.
All right, my friend. Take care.
See you, Larry, on Friday. Bye-bye.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hello, Garland Nixon here, and we got a couple of things to talk about. We've got Ukraine, EU answering Trump with drones, and of course the Jacques Bowl case. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here, and how are you? It's Monday afternoon, and so we figured generally that we were going to get some kind of a response from the EU and / Ukraine from the British Empire regarding the Trump-Putin meeting. Traditionally, it's just before the meeting. Traditionally, as you know, I've always said this for a while. What the heck did I do with my thing to clean my glasses? Well, I guess I won't be cleaning my glasses. Maybe that's just a bad habit anyway. But at any rate, so what has happened traditionally over the last several months, every time there's a rumor, an announcement, whatever you want, that Trump's going to meet Zelensky, Trump's going to talk to Putin, something that the Russians and or the United States are working together on, they're going to meet in Istanbul, wherever the hell, right? Anytime something like that is predicted, I'm going to put it from my perspective, the British Empire, as it is going to do a preemptive response. In other words, right? They're going to do a response, but the response is going to be generally before it happens. So I would expect the night before there's going to be, a terrorist attack in somewhere in Russia, an attack on some civilian targets, maybe, something outlandish, something outrageous, something over the top to basically to communicate their opposition, right? These things are a communication, right? Just like if you whatever you do, lots of things, sometimes a look on someone's face can be a communication, right? There's lots of ways to communicate. And traditionally, the way that the communication has worked was through some form of violence. And it's a pretty clear communication because it's like this. You two, or whoever it is, you all are doing something that is supposedly, is ostensibly, possibly, maybe, clandestinely, all these words, maybe it's undercover, maybe you're not really doing it, maybe it's all a fraud, but whatever it is, the appearance, the outward appearance is that this is something that at least appears to be working towards some kind of a negotiated solution. Certainly the British Empire can't have that, right? And its loyal subjects. There we go. I like this. Child of God says allegedly. That's the perfect word. That's the right word. Allegedly. So we can decide whether or not they really are working towards that, whether they're doing the right thing, whether it can work, all that. But the bottom line is the British Empire wants no part of it. So generally what they'll do the night before, 100 million, thousand million drones are fired at Moscow. Something blows up, a ship is attacked, a tanker is hit by 2-3, drones, whatever, to send the message, we ain't for this, and we don't want it to happen, and we're not going to abide it. Okay. Well, one could argue that didn't really happen with the Zelensky thing. Maybe because it was on the weekend, it would be too obvious. Maybe because Trump and Zelensky, the two of them were the only ones meeting. The Russians weren't involved, things of that nature. Maybe they felt it would be insulting to Trump to do it to do it pre-meeting, right? But what happened? Let's touch on the news. Dave DeCamp says Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said on Monday that Ukrainian forces fired 91 kamikaze drones at President Vladimir Putin's residence in Russia's Novgorod region and warned the attack would change Moscow's negotiating position. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky denied that his forces launched the attack. Now, let me defend Zelensky for a second. There ain't no guarantee that he knows that whether they did it or not. Recall something that I continually say. Zelensky ain't in charge there. He is nothing but a puppet, nothing but a figurehead of MI6. If you recall, those of us who have been following this thing since 2014, you will recall that when Zelensky was initially elected, if that's what you want to call it, that he went to the front lines, he met with these Azov battalion people, and it is reported, I don't know anything for sure, that he said to the Azovs, look, guys, you need to stop throwing these rounds down range at the Eastern Ukrainians. And they said to him, yeah, no, and we'll kill you. In other words, we are the ones who have a monopoly on violence in this country. Remember this. This is important. That last sentence was the most important sentence. monopoly on violence is the phrase. In the United States, in a government, the legitimate government in a country has a monopoly on violence, or it ain't the legitimate government. Ultimately, a government can say you have to follow the law. And if you say no, the government can then send the police or the army, whoever they want, and utilize physical violence to apprehend you. And if you resist in a violent way, they can use life-threatening actions against you, right? They could drop a bomb on you, they could shoot you, they could do things that could either threaten or take your life. The government has the monopoly on violence, and the government can say you do it or else we'll arrest you, we will take your liberty, and at some circumstances, they can use violence to a level that could potentially take your life. And at times, even the lives of others around you can be threatened. And we've seen the government do that before, right? Bomb a whole city block, for God's sake, kill innocent men, women, and children. So we know they'll do it. We can recall the move and thing in Philadelphia. We can recall the David Koresh thing. We can recall lots of instances where the FBI or the government used violence against the people, sometimes even unarmed people, and nobody was ever held accountable. Okay, so that is important to understand that the government, the legitimate government, is the one that has a monopoly on violence. I'm not saying that in a good or a bad way. If there's a king, the king can say, do this, or if it's off with your head. There's no country in the world where there's not a government that can say, I mean, if there's a legitimate government, you do this or you'll be locked up. And if you resist being locked up, they can use lethal force against you. That's reality. Here's my point. That means that's the legitimate government. Ultimately, legitimacy is decided by who can physically, who can kinetically force their will, impose their will on others. Such as this: Ukraine is part of Russia's strategic border, their strategic depth, what Russia refers to it as their near abroad, right? In other words, the US would consider Mexico, or in the instance of the Cuban Missile Crisis, they can consider the island of Cuba part of the United States strategic depth. You're not going to put missiles in there that can face us and take us out, or otherwise there's going to be a war. There's going to be a problem, right? We claim that as part of our border, our strategic depth. And how could we enforce that? Using military, using violence, right? The Russians say we claim Ukraine is part of our strategic depth, and we will enforce that using violence if necessary. And because the Russians, remember, Barack Obama said, President Putin will always have escalatory dominance. What was that? That was admitting that Russia had a monopoly of violence in Ukraine, that no matter how much we instituted, they can institute more, up to and including nuclear weapons, at which point everybody loses. So Barack Obama was saying, look, they'll take it all the way up to nukes, number one. Number two, they are on that border. They can pour weapons, they can pour men, they can pour more material in there that we just can't pour in there. And if we want to fight them in Ukraine, we can't do it. We can't go fight a superpower, or nuclear superpower, on its border and win. That's not a possibility. He was acknowledging that Russia had the what's the term I will use? Basically had the monopoly on violence within their strategic depth as a superpower, and superpowers do that. It's our strategic depth. If you get too close, we're going to fight. And any superpower, any empire in history has always said that. Another power comes too close, it's going to be me and you. Look at a lion in the wild. Look at a wolf, and the lion has some lionesses that he's having cubs by, right? What happens if another male lion comes in and challenges it? His strategic depth. He's going to fight them off. He's going to say, okay, you can challenge. I'm going to have cubs by this or these lionesses. If you come in and challenge me, I will have my monopoly, use the monopoly on violence to run you off. It's nature. It's reality. Like it or not, this is nature. This is reality. This is what we're looking at here. The Russians doing like a lion would do with their own lionesses. Lots of animals do that stuff. It is what it is. You got to face the music. Okay. So what I'm getting at is this: in the same way that way back when Vladimir Zelensky said, hey guys, stop firing at as was reported anyway, at the Eastern Ukrainians, and they said, drop dead or we'll kill you. They were actually saying, we're the ones that run, the Azov people were saying, we're the ones that run this country. Why? We may be a minority, but we are the most well-armed and the most likely to use violence. So we have the arms and we're willing to use the violence, which means we control it. I mean, if you've got 10 people, right? Okay. And only 3 of them are a member of the group, of one group. And that group says, we want to run the other 10. And the other 7 say, no. And those 3 pull out guns and say, we'll kill every one of you. Well, now they have guns and they have the monopoly on violence. So they can control, a minority can control the majority if it's well armed and if it's willing to use violence. And in the case of many instances, such as the Azov, not only are they willing to use violence, they have a propensity, they have an inclination towards using violence. They have an inclination towards domination and an inclination towards violence. Therefore, right now, it is possible that Zelensky came back and said, let's show them a thing or two. And we're going to fire 91, however many it was, 91 kamikaze drones at President Vladimir Putin's residence. It is also, now let's not forget, what did Zelensky say on like his Christmas Day? He like wished death on President Putin. So on Christmas Day, I mean, put these two together, Zelensky just said something about, yes, you know, may he perish or something like that, right? And now, after meeting with Trump, all these drones are fired. Now, it could be, that the business about Putin, see, I see Zelensky very much as a puppet. I see him very much as an actor. So I suspect that his Christmas speech was written for him, that MI6 wrote this and said, read it. And he read it. Yes, Putin, may he perish. Ha, 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 ha. Now, little did he know at the time. Now, this is just one of many scenarios. Little did he know at the time, they were planning on firing a bunch of drones at Putin to try to take him out and or figuring we may not be able to take him out, but at least we'll send a message that we want to kill him, right? So his speech is written for him by MI6. He says for Christmas, yes, Merry Christmas, and may Putin perish. And then a week later, they do this. And it's the setup for Zelensky, because it's possible that his time on this mortal plane may be coming to a screeching halt. I'm just saying, I don't wish death on anyone, including Zelensky. I'm just saying, that guy knows a lot. And sometimes, what's the old saying about snitches? Get stitches and end up in ditches, right? Knows a lot. It's very dangerous to know too much. Sometimes if you know too much, people got to tie up loose ends, if you know what I'm saying. That's all I'm saying. Sometimes people will try to tie up some loose ends, and he could be considered a loose end, right? Anyway, so it is possible that MI6 said, you say this, and then a week later, MI6 is behind this. Now, what is also quite possible is that, so let me give you 3 scenarios. Scenario 1, MI6 writes this speech. He says, may Putin perish. A week later, they do it. He's not involved in the decision making. Scenario 2, he is involved in, we're not going to call it the decision making, but at least the knowledge tree. He's part of the group that's 100%. Yes, let's fire all of these things that Putin will get him. So he's part of the knowledge tree. He's part of it. Yeah, let's do it. Now, the third possibility, not that there aren't others, but these are the ones that I see as most prominent. The third possibility is that the Azov battalion just did it, that the people in the field, you know, the ones that I said, look. Even if Zelensky signs anything, if Zelensky goes to Trump and says, I'll take your deal. Just hand it to me. And Trump, and literally the Russians write a deal and hand it to Trump, and Trump says, looks good, and initials it, and hands it to Zelensky, and Zelensky says, looks good, and initials it. I don't care what's on it. And he initials it, he signs it, and they go forward in a rose garden, and Trump and Zelensky, and Putin's there too, and they all are, you know, holding hands, dancing in a circle, and they say, sing kumbaya, and then they admit, we've got a deal, right? At that point, you think the Azov battalion is going to say, thank you, sir, Mr. Jewish leader? No, they are not. The Azov leader, the Azov battalion and their ilk will announce, if you show up back in Kiev, you're dead. We'll hang you. We'll shoot you. We'll hang you a second time and shoot you a second time. Then maybe we'll burn you. Not in effigy, right? So my point is that either way you look at it, no matter how this came out of Ukraine, via MI6, via Azov battalion, via all of the above, and the with the blessing of Zelensky doesn't matter, because Zelensky does not have the political wherewithal to do anything about it if he wanted to. Okay. And bottom line, this is their answer to Trump. That's what it is. Is their way of saying, drop dead, Trump. We ain't listening to you. What are you talking about? Zelensky has to sign this. Zelensky doesn't have anything until I say so, whatever. Zelensky doesn't have anything. Here's what the Azov people or MI6 or whoever fired those drones or whatever combination that is, what they're saying is this: Zelensky has nothing until we say it, and we're never going to say it. We're going to fight to the end. See, if you think about it, they took out of the plan. And there's so many deal breakers, but here's one: these people are racist pigs, and they feel as though the Russians are not human. It would be like asking the Nazis, yes, we've got some Jews and some black people and some, I don't know, whatever, you know, some Roma people or whatever, and you must inculcate them into the Nazi society and then, you know, allow them to have the same rights as everybody else. Why do you think the Nazis? They do what they did. They'd fight till they died over that, right? Okay. To say to these diehard Russian-hating Azov and the rest of these people, right sector, et cetera, people, hey guys, you have to get rid of these laws that discriminate against Russians, is tantamount to death to them. In fact, from their perspective, death is worse. I mean, death is better than having to sit alongside a Russian and eat and allow them to have their religion. So the bottom line is this: in that, and I would say, sadly, the political class and the ruling elite in Europe are of the same mind, in that they believe that Russians are inhuman, that Russians are lower than humans. They're Ubermenschen, right? Under humans, under men's, that it's not possible. You know, in Zen, we have a saying, that is, the tiger and the shark shall never fight, for they have no common ground, right? Okay. To say to these far right, racist, you know, just ultra nationalist Russia hating pigs, hey guys, here's what you have to do. You know, the foundation of your belief, which is to hate Russians and to want to kill Russians and to say Russians are below you. Yeah, well, you got to give that up. That the foundation of everything you stand for, of hating Russians. Yeah. You know, the foundation of your entire ideology. Yeah, you got to cough that up. That's not happening. They'll fight to the last man for that. As Dr. Jim Kavanaugh always says, if the West wants to get a deal, they're going to have to denazify Ukraine. That's why I say, ultimately, as I see it, it's hard for me. I don't like feeling this way. It's hard for me to see a scenario in which this conflict ends and there is not internal conflict in Ukraine. I don't see an avenue for this thing to end wherein the ultra nationalists, shall we say, the goose steppers say, hey guys, all right, you got us. Let's move on. And we're willing to shake hands and make amends with the Russians. That's not what goose steppers do. It's not part of their ideology, not the way things work, and they ain't about to do it. So that's where we are right now. If Trump had any doubts, now apparently Trump said, according to Yuri Ushakov, an aide to Putin, to President Putin, President Trump spoke with the Russian leader by phone on Monday and said he was shocked by the attack. The U.S. president, according to Putin, was shocked by this news and expressed outrage, stating he could not have imagined such crazy actions on the part of Kiev. Well, that was the plan. Okay, the plan was to let you know. There we go. President advised. Okay, the Russian side made it clear that such reckless actions would certainly not go unanswered. Ushakov stated the U.S. president, according to Putin, was shocked by this news, expressed outrage, stating he could not have imagined such crazy actions on the part of Kiev. So the bottom line is, now, let me say this. Do I know that Trump didn't know about it? I'm just going to guess. So don't hang me for this. Or you can if you want. I don't care. However you're in the chat. It's your chat. Say what you want. I kind of do believe in free speech. So again, we go with scenario. Scenario one, Trump knew about it and he's lying. I don't think so. Because he'd be stabbing himself in the back because he wants a deal and he doesn't want this. So I don't think Trump knew about it. the CIA could have been involved, maybe not. I definitely believe MI6 was involved. Definitely believe MI6 was involved. And of course, you know, the ultra-nationalist brigades were involved. But I don't know if Trump knew about it or not. I'm going to guess he didn't. But it's just a guess. This is pure speculation. You know, I think, to be frank, Trump may be left out of a lot of conversations that we assume that he's part of. You know, and as well as I do, the president doesn't have as much power as a lot of people think, and control is a whole lot of people think that they do. So we shall see. There. Now let's move on to number 2, and that is, let me see where we are. Okay. And that is Jacques Beau. Okay, what do we got here? What's interesting is when I search the news for it, nothing. Whoa. What's interesting is when you search Google News, and that's very telling, they won't touch it. Let's do a Brave search. Okay, let's try that. Isn't it interesting? Always search Google, because they'll tell you they'll show you what the game is. They'll show you what the system doesn't want you to see, hear, or talk about. So it's important. So let's do a Brave search on news. Go to Brave search. Jacques Beau, Brussels adds new names to blacklist and latest Russia sanctions. EU sanctions Swiss intelligence expert Jacques Beau. Who are the Westerners sanctioned by the EU? Here's what's interesting. I do a Brave search, and it's everywhere. Article after article after article after article. But when you do a Google search, not one article comes up. Isn't that interesting? That's why I say, guys, do a Google search, do a Brave search, do several different kind of search. Maybe do a Yandex search, do a search with the Chinese search engine, whatever the case may be. Who are the Westerners sanctioned by the EU for spreading Russian propaganda? Former Swiss intelligence officer targeted by new EU sanctions. Here's one, the Beau case. The EU also erases the rule of law. There we go. So let's talk about that a little bit. And I'm going to go right to what I was saying. Is it time to flee the EU? You know, historically speaking, let me just make sure I'm on. I accidentally kicked audio. Yes, I'm still good. Got my feet snaggled up in the, oh, okay, good. I just snatched out my power cord. That's fine. I can do a couple hours on this. Anyway, so let me just say this, and this is something to think about. You know, there have been times in history where people were in a particular country and they woke up one day and said, things ain't going well here. It's time to flee the country as refugees. And people fled the country as refugees, right? For one reason or another. Sometimes it's economic refugees. Sometimes there's a war going on. Sometimes there's something really bad going on. I know that in World War II, there's a famous instance of a ship full of Jewish refugees coming to the United States, getting turned away at various countries, going back, falling into the hands of the Nazis, things of that nature. So you have instances in this world where there are political refugees who are fleeing oppression, fleeing murder, fleeing all kinds of terrible things, right? Jail, you name it, refugees fleeing, right? And there are times when there were a lot of people in Nazi Germany. He looked around and said, I'm getting the hell out of here, you know? And maybe it was their ideology. Maybe they were trade unionists. Maybe they were socialist or communist. Maybe they were people who weren't down with the whole Jewish movement or whatever it was that, bothered them or that made them feel vulnerable. There were people who got the hell out. Were like, yeah, this thing's going bad. I'm out of here. Now, let's not forget, there's millions of Ukrainian refugees in Russia who are like, hey, if I stay here, these stinking Nazis are crazy. They're going to kill us. And the Ukrainian refugees, as a rule, mostly they are people of Russian ethnicity, Russian history, etc., Russian culture. They wisely got the heck out while they could, right? My point is this. You see that at a particular country at a particular time where people wake up and say, I don't like the smell of this place. You know, like the Matrix where Agent Smith says, you know what it is? It's the smell. That's what it is. And when you see von der Leyen, when you see, oh, Goose Steppin' Susie, Kaya Kallas, you got to go, uh-oh, smells like fascism, smells like goose stepping, smells like Nazis around here. And then MI6 says, hey, we can play this game too. We've got a woman whose grandfather was a Nazi. Yay. And you start looking around and you start seeing all of these people come to power whose family tree is, shall we say, if you shake the limbs of their family tree, a whole lot of goose stepping Nazis want to fall out, right? So you start looking at the people in charge and the people who are rising, and you come to realize that their legacy is that of the Third Reich, and that it smells in Europe, it smells like the rise of the Third Reich. Now, I would argue not necessarily amongst the people, that the people are victims of this Fourth Reich 3.0, 3.1, 3.5, whatever it is, that the people of Europe are victims of this. The people of Europe want a family. They want a good job. They want to go to the outdoor cafe and have some wine and cheese and grapes and talk about things. They want to do the stuff they used to do. But that ain't Europe anymore. There are a couple of things going on in Europe. Numero uno. And you can't talk about Europe without talking about the refugee crisis in Europe. See, people talk about the immigration crisis in Europe. I call it the refugee crisis in Europe. In that Europe, why are there so many Afghan refugees? Why are there so many Syrian refugees, Libyan refugees, and on and on and on? Why? Because they blew the hell out of these countries. And then all of the people from these countries ended up showing up in Europe. In fact, there is reportedly a phone call between Muammar Gaddafi and Tony Blair 2 weeks before the attack, the NATO attack on Libya, where Muammar Gaddafi allegedly said, this was the allegations, you can look it up. If you take down that, basically, let me sum it up. Libya is the gateway to Africa. And there are a lot of Africans that if they were going to make it to Europe, they'd have to go through Libya, but we have a solid border, so they can't. But if you overthrow Libya, and I don't know if he said it or not, but it is alleged that Muammar Gaddafi said to Tony Blair, Europe will turn black. It is alleged that he said that. It is alleged that basically what he said is, look, you know, and I'm going to give you my emphasis at it, right? Look, you bastards have been impoverishing Europe for the past 5 centuries, for God's sake. There's a lot of poor people. And the only thing that's blocking them from leaving there and getting here is Libya. And if you overthrow Libya, they're walking right through. And then all of these very poor people, and my emphasis added that you, particularly particularly the British, who are the scourge, the British Empire is the scourge of this stinking earth. You, British, have stolen everything that ain't nailed down. You went back and stole the nails. You set tribe against tribe. You caused nothing but war after war. You devastated Africa. And now all these damn poor Africans, if you knock off Libya, you're going to go right through Libya and they're going to come into your home. Now, one might say, why would Tony Blair do that? Because that's exactly what they wanted. They wanted to bring in cheap labor. Look, there's a lot of, think about the Middle East and all the money that is made off of conflict. The Middle East is a conflict zone. And that's Shahid Bolson, who's a guy who, he says some great things I agree with. He says some things I disagree with, but he's a brilliant guy all in all. I listen to everything he says, even though there's some I don't agree with. I do listen to him because he has some really deep philosophical and cultural statements and a deep understanding of a lot of things. In a very cynical and humorous way, I might add. Humor and ironic. But at any rate, but the bottom line was this, that the ruling elite wanted a bunch of poor folks in there to drive the cost of labor down and all the things they needed. They would have a bunch of poor people and drive the cost of everything down. And so now, if you're really, really rich, the more poor people are there, the lower the cost of everything. And guess what else? As things get cheaper, you can buy things for pennies on the dollar. And guess what? What do you need? You don't need a bunch of well-educated workers. You don't have technology in Europe. You're not allowed to have, they got no social media platforms. They got no deep seeks, chat GPTs. The US empire does not allow the Europeans to have any technological platforms whatsoever. Sorry, you can't do that. And now, it has been turned into nothing but, a resting place for refugees from around the world. It's been opened up for that. And of course, at that point, you have to teach the people who are suffering to blame the immigrants. Whatever you do, don't allow them to look at the political class and the ruling elite who created this disaster. You got to blame the people who are poorer than you are. That's the way it works. Okay. Now, here's my point. Out of all of that, I'm going somewhere with this, though it may not seem like that. Europe has been turned into an impoverished hellhole, right? No matter what. Okay. Europe has been turned into a refugee for people whose countries have been turned to hell by the globalist elite. The globalist elite goes into Syria. They have a dirty war against Syria. All these Syrians leave. 2 million Syrians end up on the shores of Europe. And they win twice because they get to steal Syria's resources and they get to lower the cost of labor and destabilize and create a conflict zone in their area too. And there's a lot of money to be made off of a conflict zone, right? So then, great, we got refugees here. We're driving down the prices of everything. We got a conflict zone and we're stealing the oil over here in whatever country. They're happy. But if you're an everyday Frenchman, you can't find a friggin' baguette. You go out for a baguette and you can find hummus and things like that, but you can't find a baguette. And you're like, hey, I'm French and I can't find a baguette. There are people in France who might like a baguette every now and then because they're French. And that's supposed to have on a beret and a baguette. Sorry, pal. Those days are behind you because your country is flooded with desperate, hungry refugees. Then you go to friggin' Germany. Hey, how about a schnitzel? Sorry, hard to find a schnitzel. I'm being facetious, but you get my picture. What you end up with is in Europe, you get a economic bloc that doesn't have the European culture that it once had because it's been filled with very poor, very desperate refugees. It's a gigantic refugee camp. That's what Europe is, a big refugee camp for the victims of the globalists and the neocon wars of piracy and thievery. They did that, and then all the refugees, you just go hang out in Europe. Number one. So Europe is destabilized economically. It's destabilized culturally. And of course, as a conflict zone, there's money to be made in a conflict zone. Lots of money to be made in a conflict zone. Now you sell lots of weapons in a conflict zone. So you have that, right? So my point is, and somebody said, too many blacks in which country? Which country are you referring to? I don't know what you're talking about. Bottom line is this. So now you have destabilized. You're a globalist elite person. You have destabilized Europe, right? It's unstable. The people are angry. The people are blaming the immigrants, not you. And you get them to march. Tommy Robinson or some clown brings them all together to blame whoever it is, the Muslims. And I don't know if you know this. This whole anti-Muslim thing, the Zionists are putting all the money in it. The Zionists are behind it 100%. It is my understanding that the Zionists hired this PR firm and said, hey, can you fix our good name? And the PR firm said, as a result of this genocide, ain't no fixing your good name. The best we can do is try to go after the Muslims and besmirch the names of Muslims, and maybe some kind of way that'll make you look a little better. And the Zionists said, okay, let's do it. So this whole, Tommy Robinson and a whole bunch of these other agents, they're just agents of Zionism. Agents of Zionism. That's all they are. So the whole anti-Muslim thing is the Zionists saying, yeah, let's do this. I'll put it like that. Anybody stupid enough to get on board those kinds of shows should. If you're like, yes, the problem we've got is these really poor people. They're destroying everything. How'd they get here? Why'd they get here? What happened? No, we need to talk about that. They're poor. They're here. It's their fault. If you believe that, go right ahead. I ain't going to try to change your mind. Now, what I would say is this. So that's what we have. And of course, you've got a war of true conflict. There's unlimited money in a conflict zone like that, right? Just think of the billions they've been able to steal as a result of the conflict in Ukraine. And of course, as it ends, they'll try to spread it into a dirty war. And then the goose-stepping Nazis will be angry, showing up in various parts of Europe, and they'll be ready to fight, right? So my point is this. You have an economic bloc that is economically deteriorating, that is culturally unstable, economically unstable, which those two things automatically mean that it is politically unstable. The people there, the people in an unstable environment like that will not necessarily be rational. So rather than sit down and figure out what's wrong, they're going to look for somebody to blame. Whose fault is it? Now, it may have started off, well, it's the immigrants that are doing this, but at some point they'll wake up. At some point they'll wake up and they'll say, well, it wasn't the immigrants that bombed Nord Stream, and there is at the root of your problem, to be quite frank. The root of the economic problems and the lack of industry is whoever these immigrants are that bombed Nord Stream pipeline. And I have a feeling that they aren't Syria or Afghanistan or North African or anything like that, okay? You might want to get your hands on the evidence of that one. But at any rate, so you already living in an economic hellhole and a military, political, and cultural area of complete and total destabilization. Now you must add something else, I think. The other thing you must add is the Jacques Beau case, which makes sense. And I'll tell you why. Because the people in charge are fascists. And fascists only know how to do one thing. Here's what fascists do. When they yell and somebody doesn't do what they want, see, the only thing they know how to do is yell. If they yell, you idiot, do what I want, and the person says no. Oh, I must not be yelling loud enough then. Yeah, that's what I want. And the person says no. Oh, well, maybe yelling ain't it. I better increase, move up the force continuum to violence. They grab the person and beat the snot out of them. Oh, now will you do what I want? And the person says no. And then, okay, well, we must bomb them. Okay, that didn't work. We must nuke them. That didn't work. We must fry them and eat them. The only thing fascists know is whatever they're doing to violence or whatever coercion they're using to influence others, if it isn't working, they must increase the coercive techniques, right? Whatever it is. You'll hear them talk about the no matter what happens in Russia, no matter what, the answer is always the same. We got to up the ante so we can pressure Putin into coming to the table where they're losing. Oh, we've got to pressure up the ante so the Russians feel, the people feel it, and then they'll pressure Putin. That ain't working. Okay, then we got to up the ante. You'll notice one common link. Everything that happens, the fascists always say we must up the ante, as the Duran always says. They don't have a reverse gear. The only thing they ever say is we're not pushing on the accelerator hard enough. Now along comes Jacques Beau, and that's this. They're losing the narrative war. Now, why are they losing the narrative war? Is it because of Jacques Beau? Is it because of Garland Nixon? Is it because of the Duran? Is it because of Judge Knapp, Larry, Scott? Is it we're the ones? No. They're losing the narrative war because two things. Number one, what's happening on the ground is that the Russians know this. The only way to win a war is to win a war. The Russians are going to talk, but on the ground, they're going to TKB, brother. They're going to take care of business. TCB, but on the street, they say TKB, right? So the Russians are going to take care of business on the battlefield. Okay, that's number one. And it gets more difficult to argue that you're winning when you're absolutely losing, right? There was an old meme that I actually have up somewhere on my Telegram from way back, and it was a picture of a bear, and he's got like a wild pig in his mouth, and the wild pig is squealing, and he says, "Help! I'm winning!" Right? That's the Ukrainians. We're winning. We're defeating the Russians. We're holding them off. Please, God, you must help us immediately. We need more of everything. But why? Because we're winning. We need everybody to help us fight. Why? Because we're winning. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but it's not there to make sense. It's a money laundering operation first and foremost. Okay, so where it gets to. So rather than look internally and say, gee, this thing ain't working for us, what do we do next? What they actually do is this. They say, we must up the ante and we're losing the narrative war. Let's look at people who are the most threatening to us. Let's look at people who are the most credible. Could you get any more credible than Jacques Beau? I got his, let's see, book says, back here, Jacques, there we go. It said, The Russian Art of War. That's the name of it. Man, I gotta get some glasses. I can't read like I used to. Woo, I can barely see that. I'm a foot away. The Russian Art of War, right? Okay, so here is a man who's a former Swiss intelligence officer, Swiss knife, right? He's a former NATO official. He's a guy who was in the Donbass, who was monitoring, I don't know if he was in it, but he was monitoring the Donbass region to see what was happening. This guy, you can't get any more firsthand information than Jacques Beau. And he has done everything he can to maintain a level of neutrality, to be an analyst, to be a professional analyst, right? That's great. And again, he's written a book on the Al-Aqsa flood. Probably not a good idea for him. That probably work that between these two, the Russian Art of War and the Al-Aqsa flood, he kind of, sealed his own fate, unfortunately, in a fascist environment. So here's my point. So now we're looking at people, leaders, who say, if you make a statement that we don't like, if you make a statement that's accurate, if you make a statement that goes against the narrative, particularly if it's an accurate statement, we will come for you. And we will make an example out of you. And we will punish you in every way, shape, and form we can. That's it. And that was Jacques Beau. So if you're a person who's watching videos like this, if you're a person who shares videos like this, if you're a person who refuses to be pushed around and you say, I ain't stopping watching whatever I want, and I'm going to not stop sharing whatever I want, right? Then, they're looking at you. They're looking at you, right? That ain't saying that every schlep in the world that they're going to go after. But the people like a Jacques Beau and some of the other people whose names that we hold, that we cherish, and people whose work we hold dear to us, have got to look in the mirror. And depending on who you are, you have to ask yourself, is it time to flee the EU as a political refugee? And I would say to some people, there are those who may at this time need to look in the mirror and start asking themselves that question. And I'm sure, as quiet as it's kept, a number of these people are already doing this. I will guarantee you that some of them are moving their assets abroad, that there are those who are saying, I'm getting my ass the hell out of the European Union. I will guarantee that there are some even businesses, corporations, things of that nature, who are doing the same, who are saying, look, I want out. I don't trust my money being here anymore. I see them trying to take the Russian assets. I see them freezing the assets of individuals. So what are they saying? They're saying, we'll go after sovereign. Now think about this. At the highest level, and from a macro perspective, they're saying we will go after the sovereign assets of a nation illegally, something that is supposed to be protected under international law that we will never touch, right? We'll go after their assets. On the bottom level, they're saying some poor little schlep, like the lady's name was Yam. We've got several people who are not countries, who do not have sovereign assets. It's just their money in their bank accounts that they've saved or whatever. And they're saying, will a nation, one of the three world powers, will steal their money, and a regular everyday person who doesn't even live in the EU. See, that's the key. Who doesn't even live in the EU will take their money too. Well, that means that everybody in between is subject to potential theft and sanctioning and jail and all of the above. So my point is, if I were a pundit, if I were a person in Europe who disagreed with the government, or who may at some point possibly disagree with the government, and I had assets in Europe, I'd be trying to figure out how to get them the hell out of Europe as quick as possible. I would be trying to figure out which country I could move my assets to ensure that the European Union won't have the capacity, excuse me, to lock them down. Sorry about that. So I can't get them. And then I would be considering relocating myself and or my family and loved ones as judiciously as possible, right? I'm serious. If I was in Europe doing what I am doing right now, I would at least, at minimum, I would not consider, I would get at least half of my assets out. I would at least, because see, there's a lot of ways you can have your money in another country and still access it. There's crypto you can buy. You can access money that way. There's gold you can buy. There's other things you can put your money in that are not purchased through the European that are bought outside. So if I'm there, I get other stuff. I get assets that I could access outside of Europe. I would have consider places I could go and maybe claim refugee status or something like that. I'd be out of here. And I might say this also, look at George Galloway. He's got the hell out. I don't think, and I've talked to other people who live in Great Britain who are saying, yeah, I'm working on getting out. A lot of people are working on getting out. So what we have now is a country, an economic bloc that has gotten to a point where people are looking at the leadership and they're saying, Kaja Kallas, really? Von der Leyen, really? If Kaja Kallas and von der Leyen are running this show, if they're the captains of this ship, I'm getting in the lifeboat. That's all I'm saying. And I never really thought I would see the point in my life where I saw a country, an area, an economic bloc that I was familiar with that would get to that point. I think there are probably people in the US that are here now, some of them for good reasons, some of them for absurd reasons, but whatever. I think there are people who are doing that from here. I do know some people who have moved to Moscow. I think that in Europe, that's going to be growing. Now, I do understand those who say, like, for instance, if someone, when I was in Russia and, I some of the interviews I did in forums, and people would say, well, would you like a Russian citizenship? Would you like to move to Russia? And I said, well, first of all, if the Russians were offer me a citizenship and a passport, and I could have a US passport and a Russian passport, I would take it in a second. I'd love to have multiple passports and multiple citizenship. That would be great for 2 or 3 countries. If I could, have whatever the max number of countries is, I'd love to have it, whatever. If I was offered a passport from you name the country, with the exception of Israel, but from a lot of countries, I'd take that passport. But while I do actively oppose U.S. foreign policy because I think it's wrong, right? And I don't think it's in the best interest of America, that doesn't mean that I don't love America, Americans, and my homeland, as much as I can call it my homeland. And that I believe that my duty to those who are here and to the younger generation who are here, my duty is to try to do the best I can to change things as best I can here. And if I can't, well, then run for it then. But my point is, yeah, if you've got a younger generation where you live, there are those that just say, I'll go down fighting. I'll stay here in this area and fight for what I believe in, and hopefully I can change things here. And that's kind of where I am. I'm just saying, if you're in Europe, you want to think about your money. You want to look for options to park your money in ways that it can't be sanctioned, so that in the event that you feel you're getting close to being sanctioned, you can get the hell out. Give yourself those options. It's time for people to consider fleeing the EU as refugees, as the potential can come where you can get arrested, you can get accused of all kinds of things. In fact, in Kaja Kallas's home country, Estonia, I believe it is, they had a couple of people, and of course they were socialists, and they were basically arguing that, in a nutshell, let me sum it up. They were arguing or better relations with Russia. They were arguing against the Ukraine conflict. They were arguing that this is not good for us. We're on Russia's border. We've got Russians here. We need to make peace with Russia. You know what they did? They convicted them of treason and gave them 14 years each. So I'm just saying, when you're in a kind of economic bloc that does that, that when you say, I want peace, that asking for peace is treasonous. It's saying, well, I think the Russians have a point. It's treasonous. You go to jail for that, and maybe worse. When it gets to that point, you really have to look around and start, as they say, looking for a life preserver. I'm just saying, and consider where your money is. Is there any way you can hide it? If you can hide some of it, you can hide a significant amount of it. You can put it in different areas, because them bastards will take it. They will take it, and they ain't just started. All right, thanks a lot. Thank you very much. A couple of things. Let me
We've got some moves being made here by China that's catching the attention of the U.S. military. They say that they're running simulation now on trying to run up into Cuba and the surrounding areas. And this is all in response to Trump's gunboat diplomacy, so to speak. Trump is now seizing vessels and holding the oil. They've blocked off this whole region. A lot of that oil is going to China, or was supposed to, China and Iran. So now they've been caught simulating this war scenario where China rolls up on Cuba and Mexico. And most of the time, this is rare. You don't get a chance to ever see or hear of any of this type of wargaming, so to speak. But they showed this on their national television, and some think that it's an ominous sign, like a warning to Trump, that Xi Jinping and the Chinese are extremely ticked off. Now, in this whole simulation, there's a red team and a blue team. The red team representing China, the blue team, the enemy, or in this case, the United States. And it says that the blue side congregated near Houston, Texas, and then they headed down southeast into the Gulf of Mexico, while the red side was seen in the Caribbean, making moves up on Cuba and swooping in also on Mexico. So this is very interesting here, that they're wargaming, simulating a war in the Caribbean. Now, I want to remind everybody, if you missed the live show, we discovered that off the Rothschild Economist magazine cover for warnings going into 2026, they show a boat, a container ship boat that has missiles coming out of it, and it's shooting America on its 250th birthday, and that boat gets hit by a satellite from space. Well, China just unveiled a cargo ship that converts into a concealable missile destroyer. And there it is, right there. You can see it right here. How convenient. So these are things popping off with this massive simulation going down surrounding the Caribbean. And at some point, it seems at any moment, things are going to pop off on this war front. And it brings it right up to our doorstep. I'll leave a link. Join me for the live streams Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, where I talk about this in greater detail. It's been WW7. Much love.
there will be more ways for you on those two platforms and global markets, because what just happened between a ground at first glance. China has just announced sanctions against a group of major U.S. defense companies and their senior executives. This includes Boeing, Northrop Grumman, L3 Harris, and Anduril Industries. This wasn't just a symbolic slap on the wrist. Beijing is actually freezing any assets that these firms and individuals hold inside China, and Beijing is banning Chinese organizations and individuals from doing business with them. The executives that are named are also barred from entering the country. Now, the question is, why would China do that, right? Well, this is a direct response to the United States threatening China by arming Taiwan. The timing here is very, very deliberate. It is very important. These sanctions come just days after the Trump administration approved a massive arms package for Taiwan. The package is worth more than $10 billion with a B, $10 billion. And if it clears Congress, it would be the largest weapons sale in the history of U.S.-Taiwan relations. We're talking about advanced systems like medium-range missiles. We're talking about drones, HIMARS launchers, self-propelled howitzers, and hundreds of ATACMS missile systems similar to those that the United States sent to Ukraine. So if you're still on the fence whether the United States provokes sovereign nations, if it continues to meddle in sovereign countries' affairs, this is your answer. Beijing expects its partners to respect one China policy. Is that too much to ask? Also, from Beijing's point of view, from Beijing's perspective, this crosses a line. It is quite clear. And Beijing has been very explicit about that. China's foreign ministry repeated a phrase that we've heard many times, but which always carries weight. It continues to say that Taiwan is, quote, the core of China's core interests, and also the first line that cannot be crossed in U.S.-China relations. In other words, on this issue, Beijing is signaling zero tolerance. It is unwilling to compromise. To understand why this matters, you have to remember how central Taiwan is to China's national identity and to China's politics. Beijing views Taiwan as a breakaway province that will eventually come under the control of the People's Republic of China. Taiwan, meanwhile, rejects that claim, and it sees itself as a separate entity while it continues purchasing weapons from the United States and other states. And we also know that there are military instructors and other forms of military support that is stationed on Taiwan itself. The United States doesn't formally recognize Taiwan, by the way, as a sovereign country, but under the Taiwan Relations Act, the United States is obligated to help Taiwan defend itself against China, of course. Officially, the United States recognizes one China policy, but in reality, in practice, its actions don't always align with that. The contradiction has defined U.S.-China tensions for decades. When we discuss trade tensions and U.S.-China geopolitical competition, it is important to contextualize it and keep the Taiwan issue front and center. Arms sales to Taiwan have always been a flashpoint, but the scale of this new package and the political context make it very different. This isn't just routine military support. This is a statement that Washington really wanted to make, but now the question is, was it truly worth it? China's response reflects its very strong stance on the issue. This is about signaling, this is about deterrence, and this is also about precedent. So when the United States claims that China limited exports of rare earth minerals, that, of course, as we know, as I wrote in great detail over on my Substack and Patreon, the same rare earth minerals that fuel U.S. defense contractors' operations, we should remember $1 billion of weapons sales to Taiwan and wonder if these sales might be one of the reasons why there is such a controversial relationship between the two great powers. China is making it very clear that companies and individuals that support Taiwan militarily will face consequences, and not just hypothetically, but concretely. Asset freezes, business bans, travel restrictions, and maybe more importantly, this is a warning to others who might get involved in future arms deals with Taiwan. This is a warning to just stay away. The United States, for its part, frames the arms sales very differently, of course. The State Department, for example, says the package supports U.S. national and economic interests, it helps Taiwan modernize its forces, and it maintains stability and military balance in the region. From Washington's perspective, arming Taiwan is all about deterring Beijing, which sounds eerily similar to the United States and its Western allies using the Minsk agreements with Russia simply to rearm Ukraine so that it will become a stronger proxy. And also, here's where things get more complicated. The Taiwan issue is often described as the most dangerous flashpoint, if not in global politics, then certainly in the United States-China great power rivalry. So it's not just about territory, of course. This is about credibility. This is about alliances, supply chains, and the balance of power. Taiwan sits at the very center of global semiconductor manufacturing too, and any disruption there would affect the world economy in an instant. So when China says that this is a red line, that it directly affects its sovereignty, it's not just rhetoric for Chinese domestic consumption alone. It is a message first and foremost to Washington, to U.S. defense firms, and to Western allies that may align with the United States and continue to sell weapons to Taiwan and send military instructors and effectively support Taiwan militarily. At the same time, in the United States, we have to know that bipartisan support for Taiwan remains very strong. Not surprisingly, of course, it still remains strong for Zelensky's regime too. What we're seeing here is not just a sudden crisis between the United States and China over Taiwan, but this is a steady unraveling, this is a steady unfolding of what will likely become a real threat in the likely not so distant future. More arms sales, more sanctions, more military exercises, more posturing. Each step actually raises the stakes, and it may potentially trigger open conflict. And that, of course, should be avoided at all costs. And that's the uncomfortable reality. That is the uncomfortable truth. The United States and China are locked in a strategic competition with Taiwan as the most sensitive pressure point. The Asia-Pacific is becoming central for the United States in terms of security, as you know. And if you follow me on X and Telegram, I recently shared that Japan is now looking to obtain its own nuclear weapons potentially. PM Takaichi is hinting at security policy changes despite the fact that Japan has been under the U.S. nuclear umbrella for decades. And that would clearly pose a threat to China. So it may be safe to say that the Taiwan issue isn't cooling down anytime soon. It is becoming more explicit and it will likely escalate. Stay tuned. I will keep you updated here on YouTube and
like they're a live chessboard, then what happened this week in Iranian waters is exactly the kind of move that makes every capital sit up straight. Because Iranian state media said the IRGC Navy seized a foreign oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz area carrying about 4 million liters of smuggled fuel, and they detained 16 foreign crew members, with an Iranian judicial official, Mojtaba Ghahramani, framing it as a serious blow against fuel smuggling. And importantly, Iran's messaging isn't "we grabbed a ship," it's "we enforced our laws inside our maritime domain." That's the frame Tehran wants the world to hear: sovereignty, enforcement, deterrence, all in one sentence. And I want you to notice the detail Iran keeps repeating because it's not accidental. The reporting says this interception happened near Keshem Island in waters Iran describes as within its territorial control, and the case was handed to judicial authorities. That's the legal wrapper Tehran uses to say this is not random, this is not a headline stunt. This is an anti-smuggling crackdown tied to court orders and a domestic economic reality because Iran has some of the world's lowest fuel prices due to heavy subsidies and currency pressure. And that price gap turns fuel into an exportable commodity for criminal networks. So when the IRGC says smuggling, they're not just talking politics. They're talking about an internal bleeding point in the economy that hits ordinary people first through shortages, inflation, and the slow grind of a weakened currency.
In line with the relentless fight against the heads of fuel smuggling networks and major fuel smugglers, yesterday in the waters of the Sea of Oman and the waters under the sovereignty of our beloved country, a foreign ship with more than 6 million litres of smuggled fuel was seized by the officers. This ship did not have any documents or records regarding its cargo or its sea voyage, and it had turned off the navigation and position indicating systems of the ship and did not pay attention to the officer's command to stop.
On YouTube, the deliberate shortage of views and likes are two tools used by YouTube-sponsored bots to limit the reach of my video. But if you like and share, it will help us break the back of censorship. Subscribe as well if you are yet to. Now, here's where it stops being an isolated incident and starts looking like a pattern, because just 2 weeks earlier, on December 12th, it was reported Iran seized another foreign tanker in the Gulf of Oman carrying 6 million litres of what Iran described as smuggled diesel, again without naming the vessel, again pushing the same storyline, illicit fuel, maritime enforcement, custody, investigation. And then if you go back to late November, Iranian outlets reported the seizure of an Eswatini-flagged vessel with about 350,000 litres of smuggled fuel. So we're watching a rolling wave of interdictions, and each one sends the same message to the region and to the West. Iran is not going to treat its waters like an open faucet for black market fuel flows. But let's be honest, nobody is watching this just as anti-smuggling, because the wider context right now is that Washington is escalating at sea too, just in a different theater, and it's Venezuela. And in the last week, it was reported that the United States intercepted a tanker called Centuries carrying about 1.8 million barrels of Venezuelan crude, allegedly bound for China, and Caracas called it international piracy, while China's foreign ministry condemned U.S. seizures as a serious violation of international law. And what you're seeing is a collision of narratives. The US says it's enforcing sanctions and fighting illicit networks. Venezuela says it's a blockade by another name. China says it's illegal. And Iran is watching all of this with a memory longer than Western headlines.
El poder de Estados Unidos fabriquen una realidad virtual y le impongan a la Venezuela de Bolívar un modelo de dominación colonial y esclavista para robarle sus recursos naturales. Eso es imposible, porque aquí hay un pueblo asentado en el territorio, en las comunidades, en las universidades, en las fábricas, en los cuarteles, y ese pueblo ha demostrado suficiente capacidad para llevar nuestra patria en buen camino, a buen ritmo, en buen tino.
It is the rare earths the USA wants. American media. Don't be swayed by the bondholders lobby, the oil lobby, the corrupt Venezuelans in Miami lobbies that pay for articles. We have the love of the people of the world. We have the support, love, and understanding of the American people by the millions.
You see? If you rewind to 2020, the United States Department of Justice openly celebrated what it called the largest U.S. seizure of Iranian fuel, around 1.116 million barrels confiscated from 4 tankers, Bella, Bering, Pandy, and Luna, with U.S. officials framing it as disrupting an IRGC-linked shipment bound for Venezuela. And whether you agree with that framing or not, ask yourself how it looks from Tehran and Caracas. You can call it law enforcement. Recently, Trump even said this about the seized Venezuelan oil. This is why I keep saying oil isn't just an economic commodity, it's a pressure lever. And shipping isn't just logistics, it's politics with engines, because sanctions are not just policy. Sanctions are coercion. They're a blockade without the formal declaration. They weaponize banking, insurance, flags, ports, and shipping registries. And then they punish the people on the ground, not the elites, the everyday family that just wants stable prices, medicine, food supply, reliable fuel. And in Iran and Venezuela, you can't talk about inflation and shortages without talking about the way sanctions squeeze supply chains and scare off legitimate trade while pushing everything into a grey zone. Now, let's stitch the historical thread because none of this is new. It's a sequel to decades of maritime brinkmanship. In the 1980s tanker war during the Iran-Iraq War, attacks on shipping in the Gulf turned oil routes into a battleground, and the lesson every Gulf state and every outside power absorbed was simple. If the Strait of Hormuz becomes contested, the world feels it immediately. Prices jump, insurers panic, navies deploy, and political decisions get made under economic fear. So when Iran today enforces interdictions around Hormuz, it's not doing it in a vacuum. It's operating inside a history where the Gulf has always been treated as a strategic lever by regional and external powers. Fast forward to 2019, and you had the Adrian Daria 1 episode, formerly Grace 1, seized by British forces in Gibraltar amid US pressure and sanctions politics. And that case became a symbol in Tehran of how Western allies collaborate to enforce US sanctions pressure far from US shores. And it's not just symbolism, it shapes doctrine. It shapes how Iran thinks about deterrence, because the message Iran took away was, if they can seize our tankers in narrow straits and overseas territories, then we need leverage in our neighborhood. We need tools that raise the costs of that kind of move. And let's talk about Venezuela and Iran as a geopolitical pairing, because Washington loves to treat these countries as isolated problems, but they function as a network under pressure. When you sanction one, the other learns, adapts, builds alternative shipping routes, trade channels, intermediaries, and yes, sometimes that includes grey market tactics. Because sanctions don't end demand, they just criminalize supply chains. And over time, that creates what you could call an axis of necessity, countries that don't agree on everything but share a common reality, that US economic power can be used as a weapon, and that resisting it requires building parallel systems and defending them politically, economically, and sometimes at sea. Now, I'm going to be very clear about my perspective. I see Iran's posture here as fundamentally defensive in a world where sanctions enforcement has crossed into maritime coercion. And I think it's dangerous when powerful states normalize seizure as law enforcement only when they do it, because that logic doesn't stay in one set of hands forever. It becomes a precedent. And once precedent is set, every regional power starts playing the same game. And that's how you slide toward a wider maritime confrontation without anyone officially declaring one, just tit-for-tat seizures, insurance shocks, convoy politics, naval shadowboxing, and one miscalculation away from a crisis nobody can control. So here's the big question I want you thinking about tonight. Who gets to decide what is legal on the seas? Because when the US seizes cargo off a country like Venezuela and ties it to sanctions narratives, it insists it's upholding order. But when Iran acts near its own islands and coastlines and says, this is smuggling, this is our jurisdiction, you know, the West treats it as illegitimate by default, and that double standard is exactly what fuels resistance, not because people love confrontation, but because people hate humiliation, and they hate watching rules change depending on who holds the microphone. Now, tell me what you think. Is this Iran smuggling enforcement? Is it deterrence? Is it retaliation by another name? Or is it all of the above at the same time? And do you think Washington's Venezuela blockade tactics are pushing the world toward a new era of tanker wars, just with sanctions lawyers instead of formal declarations? Drop your take in the comments. Hit like if you want more of these deep late night geopolitical breakdowns, and subscribe.
Important to keep in mind that we are in a new Cold War, that the United States is waging the second Cold War against China. And this is a conflict that is going to impact everyone on Earth. It is the most important conflict in the 21st century. And as part of Cold War II, the US government is pressuring countries all around the world to essentially pick a side, telling them that they either have to ally with the US-led West, or they can join along with China and the BRICS countries. But increasingly, the message from Washington is that you cannot be non-aligned. And this is especially the case with Latin America, where the US government is bringing back the 200-year-old colonial Monroe Doctrine and forcing countries in the region to break their ties with China. A perfect example of this is Panama. Donald Trump has threatened to take over the Panama Canal, and in Marco Rubio's first ever trip abroad as the US Secretary of State, he went to Panama, he visited the canal, and he forced the Panamanian government to withdraw from China's global infrastructure project, the Belt and Road Initiative. And what the US government is also doing is pressuring countries in Latin America and the Caribbean to break off formal diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China and instead to recognize Taiwan. Now, according to international law, Taiwan is part of China. There is only one China recognized by international law. That's the People's Republic of China. It's the only China sitting at the United Nations.
And what does that mean in this context?
Well, it means in terms of our standing on Taiwan as a province of China.
And the UN and international institutions recognize Taiwan as a province of China. Even the International Monetary Fund, which is based in Washington, D.C. and dominated by the US. Even if you go to the IMF's website, it says very clearly that Taiwan is a province of China. Now, I need to emphasize here that the US government has also for years been flooding Taiwan with billions of dollars of weapons, hoping to use Taiwan as a proxy in a potential future war against mainland China. And this has been bipartisan. This continued under both Democrats and Republicans, and it continued under Obama and Biden. And now the Trump administration, the second Trump administration, has approved the largest ever weapons package for Taiwan as of December 2025, worth $11.1 billion in arms for Taiwan. So Trump is no exception. He's continuing this bipartisan policy in the new Cold War against China. One of the tactics that the US government is using to try to destabilize China is by pressuring small countries, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean, and bribing leaders and offering money for these governments to cut ties with China and instead to recognize Taiwan, the so-called Republic of China. Now, almost no one on earth has actually done this. 99.52% of the global population lives in countries that recognize the People's Republic of China. Only 0.48% of the global population is represented by countries, these tiny countries that only have diplomatic relations with Taiwan, because if you recognize Taiwan as a country, then the People's Republic of China will not have diplomatic relations with you. This is the one China policy. If you look at the list of countries that recognize Taiwan, it's only 11 out of 193 UN member states, and then one non-member state, Vatican City. And if you look at the list of these countries, they are tiny. We're talking about the biggest country that recognizes Taiwan is Guatemala, and it only has a population of 18 million people. And that's the biggest. There are some Pacific Island countries like Palau that only have a population of 17,000. And the US basically controls Palau's politics and forces it to continue recognizing Taiwan. But what's important about this list is that over half of the countries on earth that recognize Taiwan are based in Latin America and the Caribbean. And that's not a coincidence. It's because the US threatens and blackmails and bribes leaders in these countries to continue recognizing Taiwan. I mean, if you look at a map of the countries that have formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan, you can barely even see the countries on the map because many of them are tiny little islands. They don't even appear on the map. And again, these countries that recognize the so-called Republic of China in violation of international law, they only represent 0.48% of the world population. However, the United States has had some success in putting in power a puppet in a country who has vowed to break relations with China. I'm talking about the Central American nation of Honduras. Now, Honduras is a pretty small country. It has a population of 10.8 million people. That's smaller than the Chinese city of Tianjin. But diplomatically and geopolitically, this is a small victory for the US government in its attempt to support Taiwan separatist forces. So what exactly is happening in Honduras? Well, the US government has succeeded in putting in power a right-wing puppet who is a close ally of Trump and who has vowed to cut relations with China and also ally closely with Israel. However, to put this right-wing US puppet in power, Washington backed an electoral coup d'etat. And throughout Honduras and even mainstream media outlets, there have been many reports showing how this is one of the most blatant examples of electoral fraud in modern history. They blatantly stole the election in broad daylight. Everyone could see it. Even the New York Times acknowledged that there are widespread reports of fraud. And by the way, the election was held on the 30th of November, and the so-called results were not announced for nearly a month. They were not announced until the end of December, around Christmas, which just illustrated how completely absurd this election was and how blatantly it was stolen by a US-backed right-wing candidate. Now, later in this analysis today, I'll look at the evidence of fraud and talk more about that. But first, I want to discuss the geopolitical implications. It's important to emphasize that the US government has been blatantly interfering in Honduras's internal affairs for decades. And in fact, in 2009, the US government backed a military coup that overthrew Honduras's democratically elected left-wing leader. And by the way, at that time, the US government was run by Barack Obama, a Democrat, and the State Department was run by Hillary Clinton. And they were the ones who originally backed the coup. However, support for this coup was completely bipartisan in Washington. And of course, Donald Trump also strongly supported Honduras's corrupt right-wing coup regime. And until 2022, Honduras was run by a dictatorship, and the dictator of Honduras was the corrupt leader Juan Orlando Hernández. And Hernández was imprisoned for trafficking more than 400 tons of cocaine and firearms. He was one of the world's worst drug traffickers. He worked with the notorious Mexican drug lord El Chapo Guzman in order to steal the elections in Honduras with the full support of the US government. And as part of the US government's meddling in Honduras's 2025 election, Donald Trump released this notorious drug trafficker from prison. Juan Orlando Hernández was freed. He was pardoned by Trump personally, and Hernández is the leader of the right-wing National Party in Honduras. And that is the extremely corrupt party that supposedly won the 2025 presidential election. The National Party's candidate, Nasri Asfura, was declared the so-called president-elect in this massive campaign of fraud backed by the Trump administration. And Donald Trump did not hide the fact that he was blatantly meddling in Honduras's internal affairs and trying to manipulate the election on behalf of this right-wing U.S. puppet, Nasri Asfura. Donald Trump repeatedly posted on social media endorsing and campaigning for this candidate. And by the way, who is Asfura? He's a wealthy oligarch, one of the richest people in Honduras. And of course, he's extremely pro-U.S. and very pro-Israel and very anti-China. And the message from Donald Trump was very clear. He told the people of Honduras that if they did not vote for this right-wing U.S. puppet, that the U.S. government was going to punish Honduras. He threatened the entire country economically. And he said, if you vote for our puppet, Nasri Asfura, we will give you money. If you don't, we will punish you. And then after Honduras's election was held, Trump again meddled in Honduras's internal affairs. He threatened the National Electoral Commission, which is extremely corrupt. I'll talk about them later. And he made it clear that they had to recognize this U.S. puppet as the so-called victor, which they eventually did a month later. But Trump claimed that they were supposedly trying to rig the election, when in reality, it was the U.S. government that was backing the most blatant fraud I have ever seen. One of the top officials of Honduras's National Electoral Council, his name is Marlon Ochoa, he repeatedly posted on social media warning the world that the U.S. government was backing a, quote, electoral coup d'etat, end quote. He talked about other corrupt counselors on the Honduran Electoral Council by name, and he mentioned how they were conspiring with foreign powers and they were hiding in a foreign embassy after refusing legal demands for a recount, which is completely illegal. And they were conspiring with the US government in order to appoint this US puppet as the so-called president, as the so-called winner of the election. And this top official of the Electoral Council said, quote, "I understand that the United States and the elites allied with organized crime want a president who responds to their interests," end quote. And that is now exactly what Washington has in Honduras. Immediately after this U.S. puppet, Nasser Yasfura, was declared the so-called winner, he held a phone call with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and in particular, in the diplomatic readout published by the U.S. State Department, it said, quote, "Secretary Rubio commended President-elect Yasfura for his advocacy of U.S. strategic objectives," end quote, making it clear that this puppet is going to support U.S. interests at the expense of the interests of his own country. The U.S. State Department also published a message publicly thanking the corrupt members of the National Electoral Council by name, thanking them for overseeing this electoral fraud backed by the U.S. government to put this corrupt drug cartel-linked puppet in power in Honduras. And in case it wasn't already blindingly obvious what Nasser Yasfura's geopolitical orientation will be, I'm going to briefly look at an article that was published in Bloomberg titled "Honduras Presidential Rival Vows to Embrace U.S., Rebuff China." In this article, Yasfura criticized the current left-wing government of Honduras that has been very pro-Palestine and also pro-China. And this right-wing U.S. puppet summarized his foreign policy very directly. He said, quote, "I have a clear triangle in mind: the United States, Israel, and Taiwan," end quote. So this is what Honduras's foreign policy is now going to be: the U.S., Israel, and Taiwan. Taiwanese media outlets have been absolutely ecstatic about this, reporting that Honduras is going to cut ties with China. Now, in order to understand this geopolitical context here, we need to go back to 2022, when a new left-wing government came to power that defeated the right-wing US-backed coup regime that was run by this drug trafficker, Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was just pardoned and released by Trump. So in 2022, a left-wing government came to power led by the president, Xiomara Castro. And then in 2023, her government cut ties with Taiwan and officially recognized China. That was in March 2023. And then 3 months later, in June, Honduras' president, Xiomara Castro, visited Beijing, and Honduras officially joined China's global infrastructure project, the Belt and Road Initiative. However, as I mentioned earlier, the U.S. government has been pressuring countries to withdraw from the Belt and Road Initiative, and Marco Rubio succeeded in forcing Panama, also a country in Central America, to withdraw from the initiative. But in Honduras, the Trump administration is going a step even further and pressuring the country to cut off ties with China. And in fact, Taiwanese media outlets have reported that Taiwanese authorities are in direct contact with this U.S. puppet who is declared the president-elect of Honduras, Nasser Yasfura. The Taipei Times newspaper reported, quote, "Taiwan has direct contact with Honduras's new president-elect, and with the assistance of the U.S., the restoration of formal diplomatic relations is something to look forward to," a senior foreign affairs official said, end quote. Now, what's very important to emphasize here is this Taiwanese official said that they're working with the U.S. It is the U.S. government that is pressuring Honduras to take this action as part of the new Cold War against China. And the Trump administration's strategy here was spelled out very clearly in the national security strategy that was published by the White House in November 2025. This document identified the Western Hemisphere as the most important region for the U.S. empire. It brought back the 200-year-old colonial Monroe Doctrine and updated it with the so-called Trump corollary, which is just blatant imperialism. It emphasized that the US should control all of the strategic natural resources and geostrategic choke points in the region. And then the national security strategy complained that, quote, non-hemispheric competitors have made major inroads into our hemisphere, end quote. So they're saying that the entire Western Hemisphere belongs to the US empire. They said, quote, the United States must be preeminent in the Western Hemisphere, a condition that allows us to assert ourselves confidently where and when we need to in the region, end quote. And they said that their goal is, quote, winding down adversarial outside influence, end quote, and making sure that all of the countries in Latin America see the United States as their, quote, partner of first choice, end quote, which is just a euphemistic way of saying that the US empire is threatening and blackmailing all of the countries in the region to put US interests above their own national interests and to cut off ties with China. And Honduras is now the poster child for this US strategy. Now, I've already explained here how China is the main target of the US empire, and we are now in the second Cold War, Cold War II, and the majority of US foreign policy revolves around trying to isolate and contain and weaken China. But there's also another important geopolitical factor involved here, and that is Israel-Palestine. Now, I mentioned that Honduras's current government is a left-wing government that has been very critical of US imperialism. And the current left-wing government of President Xiomara Castro has also strongly supported Palestine. And in fact, the Honduran government officially recalled its ambassador to Israel and condemned the horrific crimes against humanity that Israel carried out against the Palestinian people in Gaza with the full support of the US government under Trump and also under Joe Biden. I need to stress that this is bipartisan in Washington, and Biden was still the president when Honduras made the decision to withdraw its ambassador from Israel. Moreover, under the current left-wing government, Honduras also joined the Hague Group, which is a group of countries in the global south, primarily in Latin America and the Caribbean, Africa, and Southeast Asia. And these countries came together in order to try to hold Israel accountable for these crimes against humanity that it has carried out with the support of the United States. Of course, the US government has been protecting Israel and shielding it from any international consequences. But the point to take away here is that the current left-wing government of Honduras has been a strong supporter of the Palestinian people and has actually stood up against US imperialism. But of course, the new US puppet regime in Honduras is now going to do a complete 180 in its foreign policy. And the right-wing oligarch who is declared the so-called winner of the presidential election a month later, Nasri Asfoura, he openly supports Israel, and the Israeli regime has publicly praised him. Israel's foreign minister invited him to visit soon, and Israeli media outlets celebrated, writing, quote, "Friends of Israel are back," end quote. And I also need to explain something else here that confused a lot of people, because some people who don't follow Latin American politics were confused to see that Asfoura, his name is Nasri Asfoura, which is an Arab name, and he's of Palestinian descent. So a lot of people were confused, saying, wait a second, why is this Palestinian Honduran politician so pro-Israel? But I need to explain to people that if you spend time in Latin America, especially Central America, there are a lot of people of Arab origin, but they immigrated to the region in many cases like 100 years ago, many generations ago. Many of them are Christian, and they have completely assimilated with the local culture. They're not really seen as Arab. Yes, it is true that Asfoura is of Palestinian origin, but culturally, he doesn't really identify strongly with Palestinian culture. I mean, I think another way to think about this is if you go to the United States, there are so many people whose great-great-great-grandparents were immigrants from Ireland or Germany or Poland. And in most cases, North Americans do not really identify with that culture. I mean, maybe they like celebrate St. Patrick's Day, but many times these North Americans have never even visited Ireland or Poland or Germany or whatever. And it's the same thing in Latin America. There were a lot of immigrants from Middle Eastern countries, from West Asia to Latin America. And in the case of Central America, there were some very wealthy merchant families from Palestine and Syria and Lebanon. and they immigrated to Latin America because they were involved in business with the region, and they became very wealthy politicians. Nasser Fura is one example. And by the way, another good example of this was the other center-right presidential candidate in Honduras' election, Salvador Nasrallah, who is also of Palestinian descent, and he's also a very wealthy businessman and an oligarch in Honduras. But again, he is from a Palestinian Christian family that immigrated to Honduras, and they're completely assimilated, and he does not really identify with Arab culture. He is Honduran. And by the way, the same thing is true of the president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, who's also another right-wing Trump ally. Bukele comes from another Palestinian Christian family, but again, he's completely assimilated. He does not really identify with Arab culture. In fact, Bukele is extremely pro-Israel, and his regime has established very close political and diplomatic ties with the Israeli regime. And by the way, I should point out that Nayib Bukele has described himself as, quote, the coolest dictator in the world, end quote. That's what he called himself, and he's an obedient, loyal ally of both the U.S. and Israel. But again, the point I'm emphasizing here is that you should not be confused about the fact that these leaders in Central America are of distant Palestinian origin. It's like Donald Trump is of German origin, or Joe Biden was of Irish origin. But it's not really relevant to their political view. And we see that these right-wing leaders in Central America are very closely allied with the US and Israel. Okay, now that I've established all of that, I want to conclude this analysis today briefly looking at some of the evidence showing how the US government backed an electoral coup d'etat in Honduras. And to understand this, we need to go back to October, a month before the election, when the current president of Honduras, Xiomara Castro, warned that Honduran authorities had gotten recordings showing how US-backed right-wing oligarch figures were trying to steal the election and carry out fraud. And everything that they warned 1 month before the election is exactly what happened. For instance, the recordings that they obtained showed how these US-backed coup plotters were working together to change the results on the electoral transmission system. And there were videos published by workers at the National Electoral Council proving that this is exactly what happened. This top official of the Electoral Council noted how the system applied the votes of one candidate to another. I mean, this was bombshell evidence of electoral fraud. And then after the election was held on the 30th of November, there were no official results for nearly a month. And then suddenly, on the 24th of December, on Christmas Eve, these two corrupt right-wing US-backed members of the National Electoral Council reportedly went to the embassy of Argentina in Honduras' capital, Tegucigalpa, and they held a virtual meeting from inside this foreign embassy of the Javier Milei regime, which is another US puppet regime. And they declared that supposedly this US puppet, Nasser Fura, won the election without any evidence. Now, if that wasn't already crazy enough, then one of the top officials at the National Electoral Council, Marlon Ochoa, reported that these two corrupt CNE counselors were absent from work for more than 10 days, and they were hiding in an embassy. He didn't mention the embassy, but it was later shown that it was the Argentine embassy of the US puppet Javier Milei. And then suddenly, they posted the exact same message on their separate Twitter accounts. It was obvious that they coordinated this. And then a prominent lawyer in Honduras said that the system that they used had been the most failed system with the most outages and the greatest inconsistencies in history. He added, quote, "Every day it becomes clearer that these elections are being directed under the shadow of foreign interests and governments," end quote. And I should add that it's not actually that hidden. The US State Department publicly thanked these two corrupt members of the National Electoral Council who legitimated the US-backed electoral coup from inside the Argentine embassy, Ana Paula Hall and Cosette Lopez. The US State Department named them and thanked them. I mean, it's like the US government was proud of the fact that it carried out this electoral coup, and it was thanking its loyal puppets for betraying their country on behalf of the US empire. It's absolutely incredible. In response to this announcement appointing this U.S. puppet as the so-called president-elect, the current president of Honduras's Congress, Luis Redondo, he published a message on Twitter warning of an electoral coup and treason against the homeland. And he said the declaration that the right-wing National Party supposedly won the election, this is the U.S.-backed party that's very closely linked to drug cartels. He said this is totally illegal. And then the presidential candidate from the left-wing Libre Party in Honduras, the current government is from the Libre Party, she wrote that, quote, in Honduras, the National Electoral Council, following the empire's instructions, assassinated our nascent democracy. But our people are not naive. The proclamation of the so-called elected president is a fraud and a foreign imposition. They betrayed the homeland. The civilized peoples of the world must know that the elected president is one of the businessmen who requested Donald Trump's intervention. In the electoral silence, they paid for massive threatening messages against voters who receive remittances with the sole intention of twisting the popular will, end quote. What she's referencing here is that in the days leading up to the election, people in Honduras were flooded with propaganda on their phones, being sent messages and posts on social media from right-wing, very wealthy oligarchs in Honduras. And they were warning that if the right wing did not win the election, that Trump would cancel all remittances and destroy the Honduran economy. And by the way, I mean, Trump publicly said this basically on social media. He didn't say that he would cut off remittances, but he said that he would punish Honduras economically. So you cannot have a free and fair election when the most powerful country on earth is blatantly meddling in your election and blackmailing you and threatening to destroy your economy. And this presidential candidate from the left-wing Libre Party, her name is Risi Moncada, she announced that the 26 audio recordings showing the coup attempt, she said that coup plan was carried out. This was an electoral coup d'etat backed by the United States. And unfortunately, I have to say that none of this is surprising if you know about the recent history of Honduras and the fact that the U.S. government backed a military coup against Honduras's democratically elected left-wing government in 2009. Not to mention going back to the history of the 20th century when the U.S. government backed coups and carried out interventions in almost all of the countries in Latin America. The U.S. empire has been the principal enemy of the sovereignty and democracy and self-determination of the peoples of Latin America for centuries. The U.S. empire does not care one bit, one iota about democracy or human rights or any of that propaganda nonsense we hear from U.S. officials. They have been the main enemies of democracy and human rights in Latin America and much of the global South. And to conclude this analysis today, I want to briefly look at the comments made by Manuel Zelaya, who is the previous president of Honduras, the democratically elected left-wing president, who was overthrown in that U.S.-backed coup in 2009. He was the victim of the U.S.-sponsored military coup. And in response to this electoral coup, the latest coup carried out by the U.S. government in Honduras, he publicly denounced the corrupt members of the National Electoral Council who had overseen this fraud, who did not carry out the recount that was legally required of them. And he said that this is violating the sovereignty of his country. He said the economic, political, and criminal power structures that have been fighting against the left-wing Libre Party, which is his party, do not seek a president who represents the people, but rather a corrupt manager who will protect their business interests, their profits, their privileges, and their concessions. But he vowed to continue fighting. He's going to continue leading the resistance. He said, quote, "We resisted a coup d'etat. We resisted exile, persecution, prison. And in the face of this electoral coup d'etat, we will resist it too. The president of the USA, Donald Trump, here, no one surrenders. No one will hand over the homeland to you. Honduras will be free, sovereign, and independent when its destiny is once again in the hands of the people." So Honduras is going to continue to fight back against U.S. imperialism. And I think it's important to end on that note, because when we talk about geopolitics, it's often easy to forget the people on the ground who are organizing and resisting and fighting back against imperialism and defending their sovereignty. And I've talked endlessly here at Geopolitical Economy Report about how the U.S. empire has backed dozens of coups d'etat all across Latin America and also in Africa and Asia. But in many cases, the people fight back and they are eventually able to regain their sovereignty and their independence. So even though the U.S. has succeeded once again in the short term in putting in power this corrupt puppet who's going to cut ties with China and be closely allied with Israel, despite that fact, it is by no means guaranteed that he will be able to govern in the medium to the long term. And it's likely that these corrupt US-backed coup regimes run by drug cartels like the previous one, eventually these coup regimes are also going to fall. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please like and
Coffee. Follow me.